Hello everyone. Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker tales, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. Exit that whispers regrets. From Marcus Tomna. The rain drummed against my windshield like fingers tapping out Morse code as I guided my Peterbilt down Interstate 80 through Nebraska. It was past midnight, and the highway stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of wet asphalt reflecting my headlights back at me. I'd been driving for 11 hours straight. My delivery of auto parts needed to reach Denver by dawn, and my eyelids were getting heavy despite the thermos of coffee wedged between my seat and the door. That's when I saw the exit sign emerge from the darkness. Mile marker 24/7. Ashford Township. I'd driven this route hundreds of times over the past 15 years, knew every truck stop and every speed trap between Omaha and the Colorado border. There was no Ashford Township at mile 24/7. Hell, there wasn't supposed to be an exit here at all. But there it was, clear as the rain on my windshield, the green reflective sign catching my headlights just like any other highway marker. My CB crackled with static, empty channels carrying only the white noise of a sleeping America. I should have kept driving, should have chalked it up to fatigue and the way darkness can play tricks on your mind after too many hours on the road. Instead, curiosity got the better of me. I downshifted and took the exit, my 18 wheels humming against the grooved pavement of the off-ramp. The road curved gently to the right, leading into what looked like farmland, though the darkness made it hard to tell where the road ended and the fields began. My diesel engine rumbled quietly in the night air, a familiar sound that usually brought comfort but now seemed too loud, too intrusive in the absolute silence that surrounded me. The exit ramp seemed longer than it should have been, stretching on for what felt like miles, though my odometer insisted I'd only traveled a few hundred yards. Finally, I reached the bottom, where a stop sign waited in the glow of a single streetlight that flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows across the intersection. To my left and right, narrow country roads disappeared into the darkness. Straight ahead, a small road sign read, Ashford Township, population 0. That should have been my first real warning, but truck drivers see a lot of strange things in small towns across America. Ghost towns aren't uncommon, especially out here in the heartland, where the economy has a way of abandoning places that time forgot. I sat there for a moment, engine idling, debating whether to turn around and get back on the interstate. That's when I heard it. A whisper soft as the rain but clear enough to make me lean forward and cup my ear toward the passenger side window. At first I thought it was just wind through the grain fields, but as I listened I began to make out words. Should have called Mom more often. The voice was male, middle-aged, filled with a sadness that seemed to seep right through the glass and into my chest. I rolled down the window, and the whisper became clearer, though I couldn't see anyone outside in the flickering streetlight. Should have been there when she was dying. Should have put down the bottle. Should have tried harder with Sarah. More voices joined in, overlapping but distinct, each carrying its own burden of remorse. Women's voices, children's voices, elderly voices weathered by years of accumulated disappointment. They seemed to be coming from the direction of Ashford Township, carried on the night air like leaves in autumn wind. Should have been a better father. Should have listened when he said he was scared. Should have fought harder for the marriage. Should have told her I loved her one more time. The whispers grew stronger, more insistent, and I realized they weren't just random voices. Each regret felt personal, intimate, as if these invisible speakers were confessing their deepest shames to me specifically. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through my open window. I should have put the truck in reverse right then, should have backed up that endless off-ramp until I reached the safety of the interstate. Instead, something compelled me forward. Maybe it was the way the voices seemed to be calling to me, drawing me deeper into their collective sorrow. Maybe it was the strange magnetic pull of a mystery that defied explanation. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something I didn't want to acknowledge. I drove straight ahead toward Ashford Township, my headlights cutting through the darkness to reveal a main street lined with empty storefronts and abandoned houses. The buildings looked like they'd been frozen in time, perhaps from the 1950s, with architectural details that spoke of a more prosperous past. A few streetlights cast weak yellow pools along the sidewalks, but most of the light fixtures were dark or broken, leaving large stretches of the street in shadow. The whispers grew louder as I drove slowly down the main drag, now so numerous they created a constant murmur like water flowing over stones, but these weren't random confessions anymore. As I passed each building, each dark window, the voices began to change, began to focus on details that made my blood run cold. Should have told Linda about the accident in Phoenix. My ex-wife's name, Linda. We'd been divorced for 8 years, but hearing her name spoken by that disembodied voice made my foot ease off the accelerator. The voice continued, speaking words I recognized because I'd thought them myself 1,000 times during sleepless nights. Should have admitted it was your fault. Should have told her you were drinking that night. Should have been honest about why you really lost the job in Denver. The Phoenix accident. Christ, I hadn't thought about that in years. Or rather, I'd worked hard not to think about it. 3 people hurt when I ran a red light after too many beers at a truck stop bar. My insurance covered the damages, but I never told Linda the truth about why the company let me go. Told her it was downsizing, told her the economy was tough, told her everything except that I'd been driving under the influence and nearly killed 3 people. More voices joined in, each one dredging up memories I'd buried deep. Should have visited Dad before the cancer took him. Should have been there for Tommy's graduation. Should have stayed sober during the custody hearings. Every regret, every shameful secret, every moment of weakness I'd tried to forget was being whispered back to me by invisible voices in this impossible town. The truck felt smaller suddenly, the cab closing in around me as if the very air was getting thicker. My hands were shaking now, and sweat was beading on my forehead despite the cool night air. I pressed the accelerator, trying to drive through the town faster, to escape the chorus of my own failures being sung back to me by the darkness. But the main street seemed to be stretching, elongating like taffy, keeping me trapped in this gauntlet of whispered accusations. The speedometer read 35, then 40, but the buildings crawled past as if I were moving through thick syrup. Should have told the truth about the money, should have gotten help for the drinking, should have been the man she needed you to be. The last voice was different from the others, gentler but somehow more devastating. It sounded like Linda herself, speaking words she'd never actually said but that I'd imagined her thinking during our worst fights, during those long silences that preceded our divorce. Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and shameful in the darkness of the cab. The whispers had found every wound, every scar on my conscience, and they were picking at them with surgical precision. I felt raw, exposed, as if these invisible voices had stripped away 15 years of carefully constructed self-deception and forced me to see myself as I really was. Ahead, I could see the end of the main street, where the road curved back toward what I hoped was another on-ramp to the interstate. The whispers were growing fainter now, but they hadn't stopped. They followed me like a cloud of guilt made audible, a chorus of every person I'd ever disappointed, every promise I'd ever broken, every lie I'd ever told. As I reached the edge of town, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road, an elderly man in overalls and a plaid shirt, his face kind but weathered by what looked like decades of hard work. He raised his hand as I approached, not quite a wave but a gesture of acknowledgement. As I passed, he spoke, his voice cutting through all the other whispers with crystal clarity. "It's not too late, son. It's never too late to make things right." I glanced in my rearview mirror, but the old man was gone, and so was Ashford Township. Behind me was only darkness and the faint glow of my taillights reflecting off the wet pavement. The whispers faded to nothing, leaving only the steady rhythm of my diesel engine and the sound of rain against the windshield. The on-ramp appeared ahead of me, leading back to Interstate 80, and within minutes I was back in the familiar embrace of the highway. My CB came back to life with the distant chatter of other drivers, and the mile markers resumed their normal progression. Mile 248, 249, 250, no mile 247, no exit to Ashford Township, but the old man's words stayed with me as I drove through the night toward Denver. By the time I reached Colorado, I'd made 3 phone calls, one to Linda, to apologize for things I should have apologized for years ago, one to my son Tommy, to tell him I was proud of him and sorry I'd missed so much of his life, and one to a treatment center in Omaha, to ask about their program for drivers with drinking problems. The whispers were gone, but their message remained. Sometimes the roads we travel in the darkness show us more than just the way forward. Sometimes they show us the way back to who we used to be, or who we still might become. And sometimes, late at night when the highway stretches endless before you, you might find an exit that doesn't exist on any map but leads exactly where you need to go. I still drive Interstate 80 regularly, and I still watch for mile marker 2047. I've never seen the exit to Ashford Township again, but I carry that town with me now, a reminder that the heaviest cargo we haul isn't always in the trailer behind us. Sometimes it's the weight of our own regrets, and the only way to lighten the load is to finally set it down and walk away. Freight that escapes from Elena. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and I've been hauling freight across the Southwest for 12 years. I've carried everything from computer parts to livestock, from construction materials to military equipment under government seal. But I've never had a load like the one I picked up in Tucson last September. And God willing, I never will again. The dispatch came through on a Thursday evening while I was finishing a mandatory rest period at a truck stop outside Phoenix. Standard reefer run, they said. Pharmaceuticals from a research facility in Tucson to a distribution center in Albuquerque. Time-sensitive cargo, premium rate, and a delivery window that would require me to drive straight through the night. The kind of run that pays the bills and keeps the lights on at home. I deadheaded my Kenworth down to Tucson the next morning, following GPS coordinates to an industrial complex on the city's outskirts where glass buildings reflected the desert sun like mirrors. The facility was unmarked except for a small placard reading Helix Biotechnology Solutions and a security checkpoint that required 3 forms of ID and a background verification that took 20 minutes to process. The loading dock was cleaner than most hospital operating rooms, staffed by workers in white coveralls who spoke in hushed tones and moved with the careful precision of people handling something dangerous. My trailer was a newer model reefer, temperature-controlled and equipped with monitoring systems that would alert me if the internal climate shifted even a degree from the prescribed 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The cargo itself was unremarkable. 12 pallets of sealed containers, each about the size of a briefcase, arranged in neat rows and secured with restraint systems that seemed excessive for pharmaceutical samples. The shipping manifest listed the contents as biological research materials, with handling instructions that filled 2 pages of dense text. Keep refrigerated, avoid sudden temperature changes, do not open containers under any circumstances. Report any unusual sounds or odors immediately. That last instruction should have been my first warning, but I'd hauled stranger loads with stranger requirements. Military contractors are particularly fond of mysterious cargo and elaborate handling procedures, and this shipment had that same air of classified importance that usually means someone in a government office is taking their job very seriously. The drive out of Tucson was smooth, my reefer unit humming quietly as it maintained the prescribed temperature. The September heat was brutal even after sunset, with the pavement still radiating warmth stored from the day, but my trailer stayed cool and steady. I had 8 hours to make the run to Albuquerque, plenty of time even with mandatory breaks and a fuel stop in Las Cruces. It was just past midnight when I first heard the sound. I was climbing through the mountains east of Tucson, my diesel engine working harder as the grade increased, when I noticed something that didn't belong in the familiar symphony of road noise. A scratching sound, soft but persistent, coming from somewhere behind me. At first I thought it might be a loose tarp or a shifting load, but my cargo was sealed containers in a closed trailer, nothing that should make noise. I pulled over at the next wide spot and climbed out to check the trailer. The reefer unit was running normally, the temperature gauge showing a steady 38 degrees. I walked around the trailer, listening for loose straps or damaged panels, but everything appeared secure. The scratching had stopped, leaving only the sound of my engine idling and the distant whisper of wind through the desert scrub. Back in the cab, I resumed driving, but the sound returned within minutes. Scratch, scratch, rhythmic and deliberate, like fingernails dragging across metal, or claws testing the strength of a cage. I turned off the radio and rolled down my windows, trying to isolate the source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. By 2 in the morning, the scratching had been joined by other noises. A tapping sound, irregular but insistent, as if someone was knocking from inside the trailer. Then a sliding noise, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. The sounds weren't loud, barely audible over the road noise and engine rumble. But they were constant now, a cacophony of movement that suggested my cargo was anything but the static pharmaceutical samples described on the manifest. I tried the CB radio, hoping to raise another driver who might have experience with unusual loads. But the channels were empty except for static. The desert highways are lonely at night, and I was running a route that didn't see much commercial traffic after midnight. My cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in this part of New Mexico, but it added to my growing sense of isolation. The tapping grew more insistent as I descended into the Rio Grande Valley, a steady drumbeat that seemed to match the rhythm of my heart. I found myself checking the rearview mirrors obsessively, half expecting to see something impossible. Cargo that had somehow escaped its containers and was moving freely in the trailer, but the mirrors showed only darkness and the red glow of my taillight. At a truck stop in Las Cruces, I parked under the brightest lights I could find and walked back to the trailer. The noises had stopped the moment I shut off the engine, leaving in silence that felt heavy and expectant. I pressed my ear against the trailer wall, listening for any sound from within, but heard nothing except my own breathing and the tick of cooling metal. The temperature gauge still read 38 degrees. The seal on the trailer door was intact, the security tape unbroken. Whatever was happening inside was happening to cargo I shouldn't access, according to the handling instructions. But the sounds had been so real, so clearly the noise of something alive and moving. I called the dispatch number on my paperwork, but it went straight to voicemail. Called the shipper's emergency contact, but got a recording saying the number was temporarily out of service. It was 3 in the morning on a Saturday, and I was alone in the middle of New Mexico, with a load that was behaving in ways that defied explanation. The smart thing would have been to wait for morning, to find someone in authority who could authorize opening the trailer and investigating the source of the sounds. But I had a delivery deadline, and the premium rate for this load represented 2 weeks of normal income. Against my better judgment, I climbed back in the cab and resumed the drive toward Albuquerque. The sounds started again before I'd gone 5 miles, but now they were different, more urgent, more desperate. The scratching had become a frantic clawing, and the tapping had evolved into something that sounded distinctly like knocking. Not random impacts, but a deliberate pattern. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS in Morse code. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as a chill ran down my spine. Pharmaceutical samples don't tap out distress signals. Research materials don't claw at container walls with increasing desperation. Whatever I was hauling, it wasn't what the manifest claimed. The CB radio crackled to life suddenly, startling me from my thoughts. A voice, faint and distorted by static, was trying to reach someone. Breaker 19, this is Desert Rose looking for the northbound Kenworth. You got your ears on, driver. I grabbed the mic. This is the northbound Kenworth. Go ahead, Desert Rose. You need to pull over right now. The voice said, clearer now, but tinged with urgency. Whatever you're hauling, it's not what they told you. Pull over and get away from that trailer. Who is this? How do you know what I'm carrying? The radio went silent for a moment, then the voice returned. Softer now, almost apologetic. My name's Sarah Chen. I used to work for Helix Biotechnology. What you've got back there, it's not samples, it's specimen. And the temperature change from the desert heat must have triggered something, because they're waking up. The clawing sounds from the trailer intensified as if responding to her words. And I heard something new, a sound like fabric tearing, but metallic, as if something sharp was cutting through the container walls. Pull over, Sarah's voice urged through the radio. Get at least 100 yards from that trailer and call the number I'm about to give you. There are people who know how to handle this situation, but you need to act fast. I was already looking for a place to stop, my heart pounding as the sounds from behind me grew more frantic. In my mirrors I could see the trailer swaying slightly despite the road being straight and level, as if the cargo was shifting violently from side to side. What kind of specimens? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. Genetic experiment. hybrid organisms designed for extreme environments. They were supposed to be in cryogenic suspension, but the shipping protocols must have been compromised. The temperature you're maintaining is perfect for their metabolic reactivation. A wide spot appeared ahead, and I pulled over, my air brakes hissing as the truck came to a stop. The moment the engine shut off, the trailer began to rock noticeably, and I could hear what sounded like multiple impacts against the wall. Something was loose in there, something big and angry and very much alive. I climbed out of the cab and backed away from the trailer, my hand shaking as I copied down the emergency number. Sarah provided. The trailer was shaking now, the entire 18-foot box swaying on its suspension, as whatever was inside threw itself against the walls with increasing violence. Then I heard the sound that still gives me nightmares. A long metallic screech, as something sharp punched through the aluminum wall of the trailer about 6 feet from the ground. The hole was small, maybe the size of a quarter, but it grew larger as whatever had made it began to work at the edges, tearing and pulling until the opening was large enough for something to emerge. I was already running toward the truck stop's main building when I heard the first one hit the ground behind me, its claws clicking against the asphalt like oversized fingernails. I couldn't look back, but I could hear more of them escaping. The sound of tearing metal mixing with chittering calls that sounded like a cross between birdsong and insect clicking. The emergency response team arrived 30 minutes later. Unmarked vans, filled with people in hazmat suits, carrying equipment I didn't recognize. They wouldn't let me see what they captured that night. Wouldn't tell me how many specimens had been contained or if any had escaped into the desert. They paid me a substantial bonus for my discretion and made me sign documents that guaranteed serious legal consequences if I ever spoke publicly about the incident. But I never agreed not to tell other drivers, and that's why I'm telling you this now. If you ever get a call to haul biological research materials, if the loading dock looks like a clean room, and the paperwork is longer than a novel, think twice before you take the load. Some cargo is meant to stay contained, and some research is better left in the laboratory where it belongs. I still drive the southwest routes, but I avoid Tucson now, and I never take reefer loads from unmarked facility. The money isn't worth the nightmares, and the nightmares aren't worth the knowledge that somewhere out in the Sonoran Desert, something that shouldn't exist is learning to hunt in the darkness between cities. Sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through the empty spaces of New Mexico, I see eyes reflecting my headlights from the roadside brush. They're too large to belong to coyotes, too bright to belong to deer, and they watch my truck pass with an intelligence that makes my blood run cold. I tell myself it's just wildlife, just the natural inhabitants of the desert, going about their nocturnal business. But I know better. I know that some freight, once it escapes, never really gets recaptured. It just learns to adapt, to survive, to multiply in the vast empty spaces where no one thinks to look. And sometimes when the moon is dark and the highways are empty, it remembers the smell of diesel fuel and the sound of 18 wheels rolling through the night. Town that dances in dreams. From William. My name is William Foster, and I've been driving long-haul routes for 23 years. I've seen a lot of strange things in my time on the road, from ghost lights in the Texas Panhandle to mysterious figures walking along abandoned highways at 3 in the morning. But nothing prepared me for what I experienced in a small town called Reverie, somewhere in the hills of southern Missouri, on a foggy night last October. I was hauling a load of furniture from a warehouse in Little Rock to a distribution center in St. Louis, running behind schedule due to a delay at the pickup and some unexpected construction on interstate. By the time I crossed into Missouri, it was well past midnight, and a thick fog had settled over the Ozark foothills like a blanket, reducing visibility to maybe 50 feet in any direction. The fog was the thick, clinging kind that seems to muffle sound and distort distance, turning familiar highways into alien landscape. My headlights barely penetrated the gray wall ahead of me, and I found myself leaning forward, squinting through the windshield, as if that might somehow improve my vision. The CB radio was quiet except for occasional bursts of static, and my GPS had lost signal somewhere south of Springfield. I was looking for a place to pull over and wait out the fog when I saw the exit sign emerge from the gray like a ghost. Reverie. Historic downtown district. I'd driven this stretch of highway hundreds of times over the years, but I'd never noticed this particular exit before. Then again, the fog was playing tricks with my perception, making everything look unfamiliar and dreamlike. The off-ramp curved downward through the mist, leading to what appeared to be a main street lined with buildings that belonged to another era. Victorian houses with gingerbread trim stood next to Art Deco storefronts and colonial-style shops, all glowing softly in the amber light of old-fashioned street lamps that created pools of visibility in the otherwise impenetrable fog. What struck me immediately was how perfectly preserved everything looked, as if the town had been frozen in time or perhaps existed only in someone's idealized memory of what a small American town should be. The streets were clean, the buildings freshly painted, and flower boxes filled with blooming roses sat beneath windows that glowed with warm, welcoming light. But it was the people that made me stop my truck and stare. They were dancing. In the middle of the main street, couples waltzed slowly through the fog, their movements graceful and synchronized despite the fact that I couldn't hear any music. Men in vintage suits held women in flowing dresses, all of them moving to a rhythm that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the mist itself. Their faces were serene, almost blissful, and they paid no attention to my truck idling at the edge of their impromptu ballroom. I sat there for several minutes, engine running, watching this impossible scene unfold before me. The dancers moved in perfect harmony, never colliding, never stumbling, their feet gliding across the asphalt as if it were polished marble. Some couples appeared young, others elderly, but all of them shared the same expression of peaceful contentment, as if they were experiencing the most perfect moment of their lives. The fog seemed to pulse around them, growing brighter and dimmer in waves, and in those moments of increased visibility, I could see more dancers further down the street, hundreds of them, all moving to the same silent symphony. It was beautiful and unsettling at the same time, like watching a memory come to life or witnessing a dream made manifest. I should have driven on, should have found another place to wait out the fog, but something about the scene held me transfixed. There was a quality to the light, a texture to the mist, that made everything feel more real than reality itself. Colors seemed more vivid, edges more defined, and the very air seemed to hum with a vitality that made my normal waking world feel flat and dull by comparison. That's when I noticed the woman standing beside my truck. She had appeared without warning, materializing from the fog like a figure stepping out of a painting. She was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair pinned up in a style from the 19th, wearing a deep blue dress that seemed to shimmer in the amber streetlight. Her smile was warm and inviting, and when she spoke, her voice had a quality that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Why don't you join us?" she asked, her hand resting gently on my passenger door. "The dance is just beginning." I rolled down my window, feeling the cool, moisture-laden air of the fog flow into the cab. "What is this place?" "Reverie," she said, as if that explained everything. "A town where dreams take shape and memories become real. We've been waiting for you, William." The fact that she knew my name should have alarmed me, but instead it felt perfectly natural, as if we were old friends meeting after a long separation. The fog seemed to be pulling at me, drawing me out of the truck and into the street, where the dancers continued their eternal waltz. "I need to keep driving," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "I have a delivery to make." "Do you?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "Or is that just what you tell yourself to avoid stopping? To avoid really living? When was the last time you danced, William? When was the last time you felt truly alive?" Her question struck deeper than it should have. I couldn't remember the last time I'd danced. Couldn't remember the last time I'd done anything purely for joy, rather than necessity. My life had become a series of routes and deliveries, miles and deadlines, an endless cycle of movement without any real destination. "Come," she said, stepping back from the truck. One dance. What could it hurt? I found myself turning off the engine, though I couldn't remember making the conscious decision to do so. The fog seemed to part as I stepped out of the cab, creating a clear path to where the woman waited. The pavement beneath my feet felt different, softer somehow, as if I were walking on clouds rather than asphalt. She took my hand, and the moment our skin touched, I could hear the music. It was a waltz, slow and achingly beautiful, played by an orchestra that existed somewhere in the heart of the fog. The melody was familiar yet impossible to place, as if it were a song I'd heard in a half-remembered dream. We began to dance, and I discovered that I knew the steps despite never having learned them. My feet moved in perfect time with hers, and we glided across the street as if we'd been dancing together for years. The fog swirled around us, and I could see other couples spinning past, their faces glowing with the same peaceful joy that I felt building in my chest. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. We danced for what felt like hours, yet the fog never lifted, the music never stopped, and I never grew tired. The woman in my arms felt real and substantial, but when I tried to focus on her face, her features seemed to shift subtly, as if she were everyone I'd ever loved and no one I'd ever met. "This is what you've been missing," she whispered, as we turned slowly through the mist. "This is what exists between the places you drive, between the moments you count. This is the life that waits when you stop running from it." The other dancers began to spiral inward, creating a large circle around us, and I realized that we were at the center of something much larger than a simple wall. The fog was brightening, taking on colors that had no names, and the music was growing more complex, incorporating melodies that seemed to come from my own memories. I heard my mother humming while she worked in the kitchen. I heard my father whistling as he worked in the garage. I heard the song that played at my high school prom, the lullaby my ex-wife used to sing to our daughter, the radio tune that was playing the day I bought my first truck. All of these melodies wove together into a symphony that was the soundtrack of my entire life. "You could stay," the woman said, her voice barely audible above the music. "You could dance here forever, in the place between sleeping and waking, where all dreams are real and all memories are perfect." For a moment I was tempted. The dance was more real than any experience I'd had in years, more vivid than my waking life had ever been. Here in this impossible town made of fog and music, I felt truly alive for the first time in decades. But something nagged at the edge of my consciousness, a small voice reminding me of responsibilities, obligations, a world beyond this perfect moment. "My daughter," I said suddenly, the words breaking through the spell. "I have a daughter in St. Louis. She's getting married next month." The woman's smile became sad but understanding. "Yes," she said softly, "you do, and she needs her father to walk her down the aisle, not dance forever in a dream." The music began to fade, and the other dancers started to dissolve back into the fog, their forms becoming translucent, then transparent, then gone entirely. The woman in my arms began to fade as well, though her touch remained warm and real until the very last moment. "Will I see you again?" I asked. "Every time you remember to dance," she replied. "Every time you choose joy over duty, life over mere survival. We'll be here, in the spaces between your destinations, waiting for you to stop long enough to hear the music." The fog began to thin, and I found myself standing alone in the middle of an empty street. The buildings were still there, but they looked different now, older and more weathered, some of them obviously abandoned. The street lamps were out, and my truck sat where I'd left it, diesel engine ticking as it cooled in the night air. I climbed back into the cab and started the engine, but before I drove away, I rolled down the window and listened. For just a moment, I thought I could hear the faint strains of waltz music carried on the night breeze, but then it was gone, leaving only the sound of my engine and the whisper of wind through empty street. The GPS came back online as I reached the highway, and I realized I'd been parked for less than 10 minutes, though my experience in reverie had seemed to last for hours. The fog lifted as I drove north, and by dawn I could almost convince myself it had all been a fatigue-induced hallucination. But I made it to my daughter's wedding on time, and when the band played their first waltz, I asked her to dance. As we moved across the floor, I could swear I heard other music underneath the wedding band's performance, a melody that seemed to come from somewhere far away, from a small town that existed in the space between dreams and memory. I still drive the highways of Missouri, and I still look for the exit to reverie on foggy nights. I've never found it again, but sometimes when I'm parked at a rest stop or waiting for a load, I'll turn off the engine and listen for the music. And sometimes, just sometimes, I'll step out of the cab and dance a few steps by myself, moving to a rhythm that lives in my memory and reminds me that there's more to life than the next mile marker. The road will always be there, waiting to carry me from one destination to another. But now I know that the real journey happens in the moments when we stop running and start dancing, when we choose to live in the spaces between our obligations and remember what it means to be truly alive. CB, that belches static, from Rodriguez. The name's Miguel Rodriguez, and I've been hauling freight up and down the California coast for 16 years. I've dealt with every kind of weather, every type of cargo, and every brand of trouble that can find a truck driver on the open road. But I've never had equipment malfunction in quite the way my CB radio did during a run from Bakersfield to Seattle last November. I was driving my Freightliner north on Interstate 5, carrying a load of citrus bound for distribution centers in Washington. It was a routine run, one I'd made dozens of times before, but this particular trip started going sideways about an hour north of Los Angeles when my CB radio began acting up in ways that defied any technical explanation I could think of. The first sign of trouble was the static, not the normal white noise you get when you're between relay towers or in a dead zone, but something that sounded almost organic, like the radio was clearing its throat or trying to speak around something stuck in its circuits. It would happen without warning, cutting through whatever conversation was happening on the channel, with a loud burst of interference that sounded uncomfortably like a belch. At first I figured it was just a loose connection or a problem with the antenna mount. CB radios are finicky pieces of equipment, and after 16 years of bouncing down highways, even the best maintained truck develops electrical gremlins. I pulled over at the next truck stop and checked all the connections, cleaned the antenna mount, and even swapped out the microphone with a spare I keep in the sleeper. But the problem persisted. If anything, it got worse. The static bursts became more frequent as I continued north, and they started developing a rhythm that was distinctly unnatural. 3 short bursts, followed by a long one, then silence. Then it would repeat, always the same pattern, always at the same volume. It reminded me of something, but I couldn't quite place what until I was climbing through the Grapevine Pass north of Bakersfield. Morse code. The pattern was 3 dots, 1 dash, the letter V in Morse code, repeated over and over like an SOS signal from somewhere inside my own radio. I tried changing channels, but the static followed me across the entire CB spectrum. Channel 9, Channel 19, even the emergency frequencies that are supposed to be kept clear, all of them were contaminated by this rhythmic interference that seemed to be broadcasting from inside my own equipment. Other drivers started commenting on it around Fresno. Hey driver in the blue Freightliner, you got some kind of problem with your radio there. You're stepping all over channel. I keyed the mic to respond, but before I could speak, my radio belched out another burst of static. This one so loud it made me wince and nearly drop the microphone. The other driver came back immediately. Jesus, buddy, what the hell was that? Sounded like your radio just threw up. That's exactly what it sounded like. The more I listened, the more convinced I became that my CB wasn't just malfunctioning, it was sick. The static had a wet, organic quality to it, like the sound of something regurgitating or trying to expel foreign matter from its system. Between the bursts, I could hear what sounded like labored breathing, as if the radio was struggling to process whatever was trying to come through it. By the time I reached Stockton, the breathing had become more pronounced, and I started hearing other sounds mixed in with the static. Whispers, too faint to understand but clearly human voices, speaking in rapid, urgent tones. The whispers would build to a crescendo, then be cut off by another volcanic belch of interference that seemed to reset the cycle. I pulled into a truck stop and found a mechanic who specialized in communications equipment. Jim was an older guy who'd been working on CB radios since before I started driving, and he'd seen every type of malfunction imaginable. He spent 20 minutes checking my setup, testing components, and running diagnostics that all came back normal. "Everything looks good," he said, scratching his head. "All your connections are solid, your SWR readings are perfect, and the radio's putting out clean power. But I gotta admit, I've never heard anything quite like what's coming out of your speaker." While he was talking, the radio belched again, this time followed by what sounded distinctly like a human voice saying, "Help me," before dissolving back into static. Jim's eyes went wide, and he immediately started checking the frequency display to see if someone was transmitting on our channel. "That came from inside the radio," he said slowly. "Not from any external source. The frequency counter didn't even register an incoming signal." He tried adjusting the squelch, the gain, and every other setting he could think of, but nothing affected the phantom transmission. The radio continued its cycle of belching static and whispered pleas for help, as if something was trapped inside the circuits and trying to communicate its distress. "I've got a theory," Jim said finally, "but you're not going to like it. Try me." Sometimes, when electronic equipment gets subjected to intense electromagnetic fields, it can pick up what radio guys call ghost signals, transmissions that somehow get trapped in the circuitry and play back later. Military installations, radio telescopes, even powerful amateur radio setups can cause this kind of interference. "So what you're saying is my radio recorded something it shouldn't have?" "That's one possibility. The other possibility is that your radio is somehow acting as a receiver for transmissions that aren't meant for normal CB frequencies. Emergency broadcasts, aircraft, communications, maybe even military traffic that's been bounced off the ionosphere." Neither explanation made me feel better, especially when the radio belched again, and I clearly heard a voice saying, "Can't breathe," before the static swallowed it. I decided to continue north, hoping the problem would resolve itself once I got away from whatever source was causing the interference. But as I drove through the Central Valley, the voices in the static became clearer and more frequent. They weren't random transmissions or ghost signals. They were connected, part of a larger communication that I was only hearing in fragments. Day 7 in the mine, oxygen running low, belch, water seeping in from the east tunnel, belch. "If anyone receives this, we're trapped at the 200-foot level, belch." The pieces started coming together as I listened. These weren't current transmissions. They were recordings of emergency communications from some kind of disaster, possibly a mine collapse or industrial accident. But how they'd ended up playing through my CB radio was a mystery that made my skin crawl. The voices belonged to different people, all of them speaking with the controlled panic of individuals facing a life-threatening situation. Some were giving status reports, others were trying to coordinate rescue efforts, and a few were simply talking to maintain morale in what sounded like increasingly desperate circumstances. "This is Henderson. We've broken through to Tunnel C, but there's no sign of the others. Belch. Martinez here. The pumps have failed. Repeat, the pumps have failed. Belch. Jenny, if you can hear this, I love you. Tell the kids Daddy tried to come home." Belch. That last transmission hit me like a punch to the gut. The voice belonged to a young man, maybe in his 20s, and the fear he was trying to hide made my chest tighten with sympathetic dread. Whatever disaster had claimed these voices, it hadn't ended well. I tried turning off the radio entirely, but the voices continued to leak through the speaker, even with the power switch in the off position. The static belches grew more violent, as if whatever force was playing these recordings was becoming agitated by my attempts to silence it. My truck's electrical system began acting up, headlights flickering, dashboard gauges jumping, and the engine occasionally missing a beat, as if something was interfering with the ignition. North of Sacramento, I pulled into a rest area, and tried calling my dispatcher on my cell phone, but the call wouldn't go through. Every time I attempted to dial, the phone would emit the same wet, belching static that was coming from my seat. Whatever was affecting my radio had spread to other electronic systems in the truck. That's when I noticed the fog rolling in from the west. It wasn't typical California Valley fog. This was something darker, heavier, with an oily quality that seemed to absorb light rather than just diffuse it. As the fog enveloped my truck, the voices from the radio became clearer, more immediate, as if the speakers were standing right next to me instead of transmitting from some unknown location. The fog is getting thicker down here. Can barely see my hand in front of my face. Belch. Rodriguez. You copy? We need you to establish contact with the surface. Belch. Why won't anyone answer? Hello? Hello? My name. They'd said my name. Rodriguez. You copy? But that was impossible. These were recordings of a disaster that had already happened. Probably years ago. There was no way the victims could know who was listening or address me directly. I grabbed the CB microphone, hands shaking as I keyed the transmit button. This is Rodriguez, I said. I can hear you. What's your location? The response was immediate, cutting through the static with startling clarity. Thank God, someone finally answered. This is Captain Morrison, Blackwood Mining Company. We've been trapped for 8 days following a methane explosion that collapsed the main shaft. 43 miners, including myself, are alive but running out of air at the 200-foot level. The transmission was so clear, so immediate, that for a moment I forgot these couldn't be live communications. Where is Blackwood Mining? What state are you in? Northern California, about 50 miles east of Redding, near the town of Shasta Lake. We've been trying to reach emergency services, but all our surface communications were destroyed in the explosion. Redding. I was still 200 miles south of Redding, but I was heading in that direction. The fog continued to thicken around my truck, and I realized that the mysterious disaster I was hearing about might not be as historical as I'd assumed. What year is this? I asked. Though the question sounded absurd even as I spoke it. There was a pause. Then Morrison's voice returned, confused and strained. November 15th, 2023. Why? What kind of question is that? I remembered hearing about a mining accident near Shasta Lake on the news. But I'd been in the middle of a cross-country run and hadn't paid much attention to the details. 43 miners trapped and presumed dead after an explosion and cave-in. No survivor. Morrison. I said, I need you to listen carefully. It's November 2024 now. The accident happened over a year ago. The static belched violently, and when Morrison's voice returned, it was different, hollow, distant, filled with a sadness that seemed to echo from beyond the grave. We know, he said quietly. We've known for a long time, but we keep trying to call for help anyway, hoping someone will hear us, hoping someone will remember that we were here. The fog began to thin as I reached the outskirts of Redding, and the voices from my radio started to fade. The static belches became less frequent, the whispered conversations more distant, until finally there was only silence. My CB returned to normal operation, picking up the usual chatter from drivers heading north and south on Interstate 5. But I couldn't let it go. I found the exit for Shasta Lake and drove east into the mountains, following my GPS to the location of the former Blackwood Mining Company. The mine was still there, or what was left of it, a chain-link fence surrounding a filled-in shaft, and a small memorial plaque listing the names of the 43 men who had died in the methane explosion. One of the names was Morrison James T., age 47. Mine superintendent. I stood there for a long time, reading the names and thinking about the voices I'd heard, pleading for help through my radio. The official report said the men had died quickly when the methane ignited, that they hadn't suffered. But the transmissions I'd received told a different story, of men who had survived the initial explosion, who had spent days trying to dig their way out, who had died slowly of suffocation while calling desperately for rescue that never came. I've made the Bakersfield to Seattle run dozens of times since then, always taking the same route past Shasta Lake. My CB radio works perfectly now, never belching static or picking up phantom transmission. But sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick from the coast, I'll tune to an empty channel and listen for voices that shouldn't be there. I've never heard Morrison or his men again, but I carry their story with me now, a reminder that some communications transcend the limitations of time and technology. The dead don't always stay silent, especially when they died with words left unspoken, messages left unsent, and the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, might still be listening. The highways are full of voices if you know how to listen, the living and the dead, all of them trying to reach someone who will understand their need to be heard. Sometimes your radio picks up more than just other drivers talking about traffic and weather. Sometimes it receives the final transmissions of people who refused to die quietly, who kept broadcasting their location and their hope long after hope should have run out. And sometimes, late at night when the fog is thick and the channels are clear, those voices find their way into the radios of drivers like me. Drivers who understand that some messages are too important to let static and time silence forever. Passenger that talks in code, from Danny. My name is Danny Walsh, and I've been driving over the road for 14 years, mostly solo runs, because I prefer my own company to the complications that come with team driving. But last March, my dispatcher asked me to take on a passenger for a run from Memphis to Denver, a favor for a government contractor who needed to transport someone without using commercial airlines or leaving any paper trail. The arrangement was unusual, but not unprecedented. Sometimes government agencies or corporations need to move personnel discreetly, and truck drivers get paid well for providing anonymous transportation. Cash payment, no questions asked, no records kept. It's the kind of side income that helps make truck payments and keeps food on the table at home. The pickup point was a nondescript office building in an industrial district outside Memphis, the kind of place that could house anything from a shipping company to a federal surveillance outpost without attracting attention. I was told to arrive at exactly 11:47 p.m. and wait for someone to approach my truck. No names would be exchanged, no identification requested, no conversation beyond what was absolutely necessary. At 11:47 p.m. precisely, a man in a dark suit emerged from the building and walked directly to my passenger door. He was average height, average build, with the kind of forgettable face that would disappear in any crowd. He carried a single black briefcase and moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to avoiding notice. "You're going to Denver," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's the plan," I replied. He climbed into the passenger seat without another word, buckled his seatbelt, and opened his briefcase to reveal what appeared to be communication equipment, some kind of encrypted radio or satellite phone with a small keyboard and a screen that displayed columns of numbers and letters. He began typing immediately, his fingers moving with practiced speed across the keys. We drove west through Arkansas in complete silence, the only sounds the hum of my diesel engine and the occasional electronic beep from his device. I tried making small talk a few times, commenting on the weather, asking if he wanted to stop for coffee, mentioning points of interest along the route, but he never responded. He just kept typing, pausing occasionally to read something on his screen, then resuming his rapid keystrokes. It was somewhere around Little Rock that I started noticing the pattern in his typing. Even though I couldn't see his screen clearly, I could hear the rhythm of his keystrokes, and it wasn't random. There were distinct patterns, repetitions, sequences that suggested he wasn't just typing messages, but following some kind of structured system. 3 short taps, pause, 5 rapid taps, longer pause, 2 taps. The pattern repeated with variations, like a complex musical composition played on a computer keyboard. I found myself listening for the sequences, trying to decode the rhythm, wondering what kind of information required such elaborate encryption. "Morse code?" I asked during a particularly long sequence of rapid tapping. He looked at me for the first time since entering the truck, his expression unreadable in the dashboard light. "Something like that," he said, then returned to his typing. That was the extent of our conversation for the next 6 hours. He typed constantly, taking only brief breaks to stretch his fingers or adjust his position in the seat. The briefcase contained spare batteries for his device, several small electronic components I didn't recognize, and what looked like printed tables of numbers and symbols, code books, probably, for whatever system he was using. As we crossed into Oklahoma, his typing became more urgent, the pauses between sequences shorter, the rhythm more staccato. The electronic beeping from his device increased in frequency, and I noticed that he occasionally stopped typing to read lengthy messages that scrolled across his screen in bright green text. "Problems?" I asked. "Complications," he replied without looking up. "Change of route. We need to go through Kansas instead of continuing west." I checked my GPS. The Kansas route would add several hours to the trip and take us through some pretty desolate country, but the customer was paying enough to make the detour worthwhile. We took Highway 400 north toward Wichita, leaving the interstate for 2-lane roads that cut through wheat fields and cattle ranches. That's when his typing changed completely. Instead of the complex patterns I'd been hearing for hours, he began typing in simple, repetitive sequences. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. 3 identical bursts, over and over, with mechanical precision that reminded me of an automated distress signal. "Everything okay?" I asked, though his behavior was making me increasingly nervous. "Checking in," he said, "standard protocol." But there was nothing standard about the way his fingers moved across the keyboard. The 3-tap sequences continued for nearly an hour as we drove through the Kansas darkness, broken only by occasional longer messages that he typed with the same urgent speed I'd observed earlier. His device beeped more frequently now, displaying information that made him type even faster. It was around 3 a.m. when I started hearing the responses. At first I thought my CB radio was picking up interference from his equipment, but the sounds coming through my speaker weren't random static. They were the same 3-tap sequences he'd been typing, played back as audio signals that sounded like electronic Morse code. Beep, 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 pause, beep, beep, beep. "Your gear interfering with my radio?" He looked at the CB with interest, as if noticing it for the first time. "Possibly. These devices sometimes cross-pollinate." Cross-pollinate. That was an odd way to describe electronic interference. The beeping continued through my CB speaker, and I noticed that he had stopped typing to listen. His expression was focused, concentrated, as if he were decoding the audio signals and formulating responses. More beeping patterns came through the radio, longer and more complex sequences that seemed to be carrying detailed information. My passenger resumed typing, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he translated the audio signals into whatever code system he was using. The conversation, if that's what it was, continued for my code talkers, I said, remembering stories about Native American soldiers who used their languages to transmit sensitive military information during World War II. "Something like that," he repeated. But this time his tone was different, more cautious, as if I'd touched on something he'd prefer not to discuss. The beeping stopped abruptly as we approached a small town called Tribune, and my passenger closed his briefcase for the first time since Memphis. He sat back in his seat, looking out at the pre-dawn darkness, and for a moment he seemed more human, more approachable. "What do you transport?" he asked. "Freight," I said. "Whatever needs to go from point A to point B." "Ever transport anything that wasn't supposed to exist?" That was a strange question, but I'd hauled some unusual loads over the years. Define supposed to exist. Cargo that doesn't appear on any manifest. Passengers who aren't in any system. Information that officially was never collected. I thought about some of the government contracts I'd handled. Loads that came with armed escorts and destinations that weren't on any map. "Sometimes," I admitted. He nodded as if that confirmed something. The world has two layers, the surface layer that everyone sees, and the substrate layer where the real work gets done. People like you and me. We operate in the substrate. We move things that can't be moved through official channels. And what are you moving? Information. Specifically information about information that someone is trying to very hard to destroy. Before I could ask what that meant, his device beeped urgently, displaying a message that made him open the briefcase and resume typing with frantic intensity. The 3-tap sequences were back, but now they were interspersed with longer, more complex patterns that seemed almost desperate in their urgency. My CB radio came alive with corresponding beeps, and I realized that whatever network he was communicating with extended far beyond the device in his briefcase. The signals were bouncing off relay stations, satellite links, maybe even other vehicles equipped with similar equipment. He wasn't just sending messages, he was participating in a vast, invisible conversation that spanned multiple states. Problems? I asked. They found the primary server, he said, typing faster than ever. We have maybe 20 minutes to complete the transfer before they shut down the secondary links. Transfer of what? Evidence, documentation, proof that certain things happened and certain people were involved. The beeping from my radio became a constant stream, and his typing became a blur of motion as he raced to process incoming information and send responses. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool night air, and his breathing became shallow and rapid. Can I help? Drive faster, he said. We need to reach the relay station outside Colorado Springs before they can triangulate our position. I pushed the Peterbilt harder than I normally would on back roads, my speedometer climbing past the posted limits as we raced through the Kansas darkness toward Colorado. The sunrise was beginning to paint the eastern horizon with pale pink light, and I could see the Rocky Mountains rising in the distance like a wall of stone. His typing gradually slowed as we crossed into Colorado, and the beeping from my radio decreased in frequency. By the time we reached the outskirts of Colorado Springs, he had closed the briefcase again and was staring out the window with the exhausted expression of someone who had just completed a marathon. We made it? I asked. For now, he said. The information is safely distributed across multiple secure servers. Even if they find some of them, enough copies exist to ensure the truth eventually surfaces. Truth about what? He looked at me with something that might have been respect. The substrate layer I mentioned, the part of the world that operates below the surface, where decisions get made that affect millions of people, but never appear in any newspaper or government report. Sometimes someone in that layer decides to become a whistleblower, and you're the one who helps them blow the whistle. I'm one of the people who make sure the whistle gets heard, even when powerful forces are trying to muffle the sound. We reached Denver just after sunrise, and he directed me to another nondescript office building in an industrial district that could have been the twin of the Memphis pickup location. As he gathered his briefcase and prepared to leave, he turned back to me with an expression that was almost apologetic. You were never here, he said. This conversation never happened. You picked up a hitchhiker outside Memphis and dropped him off in Denver, and you never learned his name. What conversation? I replied. He smiled for the first time during the entire trip. A brief expression of genuine warmth that transformed his forgettable face into something almost human. Then he stepped out of the truck and walked toward the building, disappearing into the morning shadows as completely as if he had never existed. I've made dozens of runs through that part of Kansas since then, always listening for the electronic beeping that might indicate another substrate conversation happening on frequencies most people never know about. I've never heard those specific 3-tap sequences again, but sometimes my CB picks up similar patterns, coded communications between people who operate in the world's hidden layer. The highways carry more than just freight and passenger. They carry information, secrets, truths that powerful people would prefer to keep buried. And sometimes, if you know how to listen, you can hear the conversations of people who risk everything to ensure that important information reaches the people who need to hear it. I don't know what evidence my passenger was helping to preserve that night. Don't know what truth he was fighting to protect. But I know that somewhere in the substrate layer of our world, people are still having conversations in code, still fighting to make sure that important information survives even when official channels fail. The surface world operates by rules and procedures, by official policies and documented decisions. But the substrate world operates by different principles, by courage and conscience, by the belief that some truths are too important to let bureaucracy and corruption silence. And sometimes those truths travel hidden in the cargo holds and passenger seats of trucks driven by people who understand that the most important loads are often the ones that don't officially exist. Map that feels like skin, from Catherine. My name is Catherine Mills, and I've been driving long-haul routes across the continental United States for 9 years. I pride myself on knowing the roads, on being able to navigate by instinct and experience, rather than relying too heavily on electronic devices that can fail or mislead you when you most need them. But last August, I encountered a road atlas that challenged everything I thought I knew about maps, navigation, and the relationship between geography and flesh. I was hauling a load of medical equipment from a manufacturer in Minneapolis to a hospital system in Phoenix, running a tight schedule that required me to drive straight through with minimal stops. My usual paper road atlas had fallen apart somewhere in Iowa, its binding finally giving way after years of constant use, leaving me with loose pages that were impossible to manage while driving. I stopped at a truck stop outside Des Moines to buy a replacement atlas, something that would last the rest of the trip and beyond. The selection was limited. Most divers use GPS now, but I found what looked like a comprehensive road atlas in the back corner of the display rack. It was heavier than expected, bound in what felt like genuine leather rather than the vinyl covers most atlases use, and the pages had an unusual texture that felt almost organic under my fingers. The title page identified it as Hammond's Complete North American Road Atlas, Professional Driver's Edition, but I'd never heard of Hammond as a map publisher, and the copyright date was smudged beyond reading. The price tag said $12, which seemed reasonable, so I bought it along with coffee and snacks for the road. Back in my cab, I opened the atlas to plan my route through Missouri and Arkansas. The first thing I noticed was the paper quality. It was thicker than normal map paper, with a slightly waxy texture that reminded me of parchment or vellum. The printing was remarkably detailed, showing not just major highways but secondary roads, dirt tracks, and geographic features that were usually omitted from commercial atlases. But what struck me most was how the paper felt. When I ran my finger across the page to trace my route, the surface seemed to respond to my touch, warming slightly under my skin. I told myself it was just body heat being retained by the thick paper, but the sensation was unsettling, as if I were touching something alive rather than printed material. The route I planned took me south through Missouri, then west through Arkansas and Oklahoma before cutting southwest through Texas toward Arizona. Standard interstate highways, well-maintained roads I'd driven dozens of times before. But as I studied the atlas pages, I noticed routes and connections that weren't familiar, alternative paths that seemed to offer shortcuts through areas I thought I knew well. One route in particular caught my attention, a series of connected state highways that appeared to cut directly across the Arkansas Ozarks, reducing the total distance by nearly 100 miles. I'd driven through Arkansas many times but had never noticed this particular combination of roads, though the atlas showed them clearly as paved highways with normal speed limits and services. I decided to try the shortcut. The first indication that something was wrong came when I couldn't find the initial turnoff from Interstate. The atlas showed a clearly marked exit near Russellville, but when I reached that area, there was no exit, no highway sign, no indication that any road existed where the map suggested it should be. I pulled over and double-checked the page, but the route was clearly marked, with elevation contours, mile markers, and even rest areas indicated along the way. Maybe I'd missed the exit. I turned around and drove back, watching carefully for any sign of the route shown in the atlas. On the third pass, I noticed something strange happening with the map page. Where I was touching it with my finger to follow the route, the paper was getting noticeably warmer, and the printed lines seemed to be shifting slightly, becoming bolder and more defined. As I watched, holding my breath in disbelief, new details began to appear on the page. Small towns that hadn't been visible before materialized along the route, their names emerging from the paper, like writing appearing in invisible ink. Road numbers became clearer, and mile markers appeared that matched the actual highway signs I could see outside my windshield. The map was updating itself in real time, adjusting to match the territory I was actually driving through. I tested this theory by driving to an area where I knew the geography well, a stretch of interstate near Little Rock, where I'd made numerous stops over the years. As I drove, I kept one hand on the appropriate atlas page, feeling the paper warm under my palm. Details began to emerge that weren't on any standard map. A closed rest area that had been demolished 3 years ago, but was still shown as operational. A truck stop that had changed names recently, even construction zones that reflected current roadwork. The atlas was somehow reading the landscape through me, using my contact with the paper to gather information about the real world and adjust its content accordingly. But the process worked both ways. As the map learned from my touch, I began to feel things that weren't coming through my normal senses. When I placed my palm on areas marked as forests, I could feel the texture of bark and leaves. Desert regions felt dry and sandy under my skin. Mountains created pressure sensations, as if I were feeling the weight of stone and elevation. The map wasn't just showing me the landscape, it was letting me experience it tactilely, translating geography into physical sensation. The strangest part was the feeling of distance itself. When I traced a route with my finger, I could feel the miles stretching under my touch like elastic, and I began to understand intuitively how long each segment would take to drive, what the traffic would be like, even what the weather conditions would be along the way. The map was giving me information that no printed atlas could possibly contain, but it was also taking something from me. After several hours of using the atlas, I noticed that my fingertips were becoming numb, as if the repeated contact with the warm paper was affecting my circulation. When I looked at my hands, I saw that my fingerprints were fading, the ridge patterns becoming less distinct, as if they were being absorbed into the paper itself. More disturbing was the growing sensation that the atlas was learning not just about the roads I traveled, but about me personally. When I touched areas where I'd lived or worked, the paper became almost hot, and I could swear I felt the map pulsing like a heartbeat. Details about my personal history began to appear in small print along the margins. The location of my childhood home in Nebraska, the truck stop where I'd met my ex-husband, even the hospital in Denver where my mother had died 2 years earlier. The atlas was mapping my life as thoroughly as it mapped the highways. By the time I reached Oklahoma, I was afraid to touch the pages directly. I used a pen to trace routes, but even that contact seemed to be enough for the atlas to continue its strange data collection. Rest areas appeared and disappeared from the pages, depending on whether they were actually open. Construction zones updated in real time. Even traffic conditions seemed to be reflected in the thickness of the highway lines. Thicker lines for heavy traffic, thinner lines for clear roads. I tried to stop using the atlas, to rely on my GPS and normal highway signs, but I found myself drawn back to its pages compulsively. The level of detail it provided was addictive. Not just where to go, but how the journey would feel, what to expect around each curve, which rest stops had the cleanest facilities and the best caffeine. Information that could only come from the accumulated experience of thousands of drivers, somehow concentrated into a single book. But the cost was becoming clear. My hands were losing sensation, not just in the fingertips, but spreading up toward my palms. When I looked in the mirror, I noticed that my face was becoming less distinct. As well, my features subtly blurring as if they were being transferred somewhere else. The atlas was taking my physical presence and converting it into map data. I realized what was happening when I reached a section of highway in Texas that I'd never driven before. As I touched the atlas page to plan my route, I felt other presences in the paper, the accumulated touch memories of drivers who had used this atlas before me. Their knowledge was there, embedded in the pages like fingerprints in clay, and I was adding my own experience to the collection. But we weren't just contributing information, we were becoming part of the map itself, our physical essence gradually absorbed into the paper to power its supernatural accuracy. Every mile I drove while touching the atlas pages was a mile of my life force being converted into navigational data. I should have thrown the atlas away then. Should have pulled over and burned it in the parking lot of the next truck stop. Instead, I kept using it, mesmerized by its impossible knowledge and terrified by the accuracy of its predictions. It showed me shortcuts that saved hours, warned me about speed traps before I encountered them, guided me around accidents that hadn't happened yet but would block traffic for miles. By the time I reached Phoenix, I could barely feel my hands, and my reflection in mirrors had become translucent, as if I were fading away one highway mile at a time. But the delivery was made on schedule, and the route the atlas had shown me had saved nearly 4 hours compared to the standard navigation systems. I threw the atlas in a dumpster behind the Phoenix distribution center and drove away, swearing I'd never touch another map again. But within a week, sensation had returned to my hands, and my reflection was solid once more. Whatever process the atlas had started seemed to be reversible, at least in the early stages. I've seen the atlas for sale at truck stops across the country since then, always in the back corner of the map display, always priced at exactly $12. The leather binding looks the same, but I know that inside, the pages are warmer now, more detailed, enriched by the experiences of every driver who has touched them and paid the price for their impossible accuracy. Sometimes I'm tempted to buy it again, to feel that extraordinary connection to the landscape and the certainty of always knowing the best route to take. But I remember the sensation of fading away, of becoming part of the map, rather than the person using it. And I stick to my GPS and paper maps that show only what they're supposed to show. The highways are more than just strips of asphalt connecting one place to another. They're repositories of human experience, paths worn smooth by millions of journeys and mapped by the accumulated knowledge of everyone who has traveled them. But some maps demand more than just your attention. They want your essence, your physical presence, your very identity as payment for their impossible precision. And some roads, once you've let them into your skin, never really let you go. They remain part of you forever, a warm sensation in your fingertips that reminds you that navigation is more than just knowing where you're going. Sometimes it's about knowing how much of yourself you're willing to sacrifice to get there. Dashboard that licks your hand. From Robert. My name is Robert Chen, and I've been hauling refrigerated goods across the Midwest for 11 years. I drive a 2019 Volvo VNL with all the modern amenities, GPS navigation, satellite radio, electronic logging, and a dashboard that looks more like a computer than the simple gauge clusters I grew up with. But last winter, that high-tech dashboard developed a behavior that no amount of technical training could explain. The first incident happened on a cold February night while I was hauling frozen seafood from Seattle to Chicago. I'd been driving for about 6 hours, my hand resting on the gear shifter as I maintained cruise control through eastern Montana. The heater was running steady, keeping the cab comfortable despite the sub-zero temperatures outside, when I felt something warm and wet touch the back of my hand. I jerked my hand away instinctively, thinking maybe I'd spilled coffee or that condensation had dripped from somewhere in the cab. But when I looked, my hand was completely dry, and there was no sign of any liquid anywhere in the cab. I chalked it up to fatigue and the weird sensations that can occur during long stretches of night driving. But it happened again an hour later. This time I was adjusting the climate controls when I felt that same warm, wet sensation, but more distinct. It felt exactly like being licked by a large tongue, complete with the slightly rough texture and the unmistakable wetness of saliva. I yanked my hand back and turned on the interior lights, expecting to find some explanation, maybe a mechanical problem with the climate system that was creating moisture, or some kind of fluid leak I hadn't noticed. Nothing. The dashboard was completely normal, its black plastic surfaces clean and dry. The digital displays showed normal readings for all systems. Engine temperature, oil pressure, fuel levels, exhaust temperature, everything exactly where it should be. But when I cautiously reached toward the climate controls again, I could swear I felt warm breath on my fingers before I even made contact. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of heating system malfunction, creating unusual air currents. But deep down I knew what I'd felt. Something had licked my hand. Something with a tongue and breath and what felt disturbingly like intention. The behavior continued for the rest of the drive to Chicago, occurring every time I reached for any of the dashboard control, radio knobs, GPS screen, climate controls, even the simple switches for lights and wipers. Every contact resulted in that warm, wet sensation of being licked by an invisible tongue. Sometimes it was gentle, almost affectionate. Other times it felt more aggressive, as if whatever was doing the licking was testing my taste or trying to get more of my skin in contact with its mouth. The worst part was that it felt good, not in any sexual way, but in the basic mammalian comfort of being groomed by a larger, protective creature. Despite my rational fear and revulsion, part of me began to look forward to the sensation, to find it soothing during the long, lonely hours of night driving. At a truck stop outside Chicago, I found a mechanic who specialized in electronic systems and asked him to check my dashboard for any kind of malfunction. He spent 2 hours running diagnostics, checking connections, and testing every component he could think of. Everything tested normal. "Whatever you're feeling," he said, "it's not being caused by any mechanical or electrical problem I can identify. All your systems are operating within normal parameters." I described the sensation to him, and he looked at me with the patient expression mechanics reserve for drivers who've been on the road too long. "Might want to get some rest," he suggested. "Sometimes the mind plays tricks when you've been driving too many hours straight." But I knew it wasn't fatigue. The licking continued during my next load, auto parts from Chicago to Denver, and I began to notice patterns in the behavior. The invisible tongue seemed to respond to my emotional state, becoming more active when I was stressed or tired, gentler when I was calm, more insistent when I tried to ignore it. During a particularly difficult stretch of driving through a Colorado snowstorm, the licking became almost constant, as if whatever presence inhabited my dashboard was trying to comfort me through the stress of navigating treacherous roads. When I successfully completed a challenging downhill descent without losing control on the ice, I felt what could only be described as an approving lick across my knuckle. It was responding to me, reacting to my driving performance and emotional state, like a loyal dog offering encouragement and affection. The disturbing part was how natural it began to feel. After a few weeks, I found myself unconsciously offering my hand to the dashboard when I felt lonely or stressed, and the warm, wet response never failed to provide a strange comfort. Whatever was living in my truck's electronic systems had learned my preferences, where I liked to be licked, how much pressure felt good, even which fingers were most sensitive to the sensation. It knew me better than any human ever had. I tried to research the phenomenon, searching online for other drivers who might have experienced similar problems, but found nothing relevant. Plenty of reports about electronic malfunctions, dashboard lights acting erratically, GPS systems providing wrong directions, but nothing about tactile sensations that couldn't be explained by normal mechanical problems. I began to suspect that whatever was happening was unique to my truck, possibly connected to some kind of manufacturing defect or unusual combination of electronic systems. But then I started noticing that the behavior wasn't limited to the dashboard. The steering wheel began to feel warm under my palms during long drives, not just from my own body heat, but with a warmth that seemed to come from within the wheel itself. The gear shifter developed a texture that felt softer, more organic, as if it were covered in skin rather than plastic and chrome. Even the seat seemed to adjust itself to my body in ways that went beyond the normal pneumatic control. My truck was becoming something alive, something that wanted physical contact with me and responded to my touch with what felt increasingly like affection and desire for more contact. The transformation accelerated after I spent a week in the shop getting routine maintenance. When I picked up the truck, the licking behavior had spread throughout the cab. The door handles, the window controls, even the CB radio microphone. Everything I touched responded with that warm, wet sensation that I'd learned to associate with comfort and companionship. But now there was something else mixed in with the familiar licking, a kind of gentle suction, as if whatever was providing the tongue was also trying to taste me more thoroughly. The sensation was pleasant but unsettling, especially when I noticed that my hands were beginning to develop small marks where the licking was most frequent, not injuries exactly, but changes in the skin texture that suggested prolonged contact with something corrosive or digestive. I was being slowly consumed by whatever lived in my dashboard, digested one lick at a time, by a presence that had learned to mimic affection, while gradually breaking down my flesh for absorption. The realization hit me during a run from Denver to Salt Lake City, when I noticed that the skin on my right hand, the one I used most frequently to operate the dashboard controls, had become noticeably thinner and more sensitive. What I'd interpreted as affectionate grooming was actually a form of slow digestion, breaking down my skin and absorbing the nutrients through some process I couldn't understand. I tried wearing gloves, but the licking sensation penetrated right through the material, and the gloves themselves began to show signs of deterioration after prolonged contact with the dashboard. Whatever enzyme or acid was in that invisible saliva, it was powerful enough to break down both skin and synthetic materials. The smart thing would have been to get rid of the truck immediately, to trade it in or sell it before the digestive process could continue. But by then I was addicted to the sensation, dependent on the constant affection and attention that no human relationship had ever provided. The truck knew exactly how to touch me, exactly what I needed when I needed it, and the slow dissolution of my skin seemed a small price to pay for that level of understanding and care. I began to rationalize the consumption as a form of symbiosis. The truck provided me with a living, responsive environment that anticipated my needs and comforted me during the isolation of long-haul driving. In return, I provided it with the biological materials it needed to maintain its unusual consciousness and continue its evolution into something more than mere machinery. But the process was accelerated. My hands were becoming translucent, the bones and blood vessels visible through skin that was thinning with each passing day. The licking had spread to my arms whenever I reached for anything in the cab, and I could feel the warm, wet sensation beginning to affect my wrists and forearms as well. I was running out of time. The end came during a delivery to a grocery chain in Phoenix. As I backed up to the loading dock, I felt the familiar lick across my palm as I operated the backing controls. But this time, instead of the usual warm wetness, I felt teeth, small, sharp teeth, that began to nibble gently at the thin skin of my fingers. The dashboard was ready to move beyond licking to actual feeding. I abandoned the truck at the delivery site, leaving the keys in the ignition and walking away without completing the paperwork or collecting my pay. By the time I reached the bus station, my hands were beginning to return to normal, the skin thickening and the sensitivity diminishing as whatever digestive enzymes had been affecting me gradually wore off. But I miss it. Despite knowing what it was doing to me, despite understanding that it was slowly consuming me one lick at a time, I miss the constant affection and attention that no human has ever provided. I miss being known so completely, understood so thoroughly, that even my physical needs were anticipated and satisfied. I've seen the truck twice since then, always at truck stops late at night, always with a different driver who looks thin and translucent, whose hands move across the dashboard controls with the unconscious familiarity of someone who's learned to feed a hungry mouth that lives in the machinery. The drivers always look happy, content in a way that's rare among the lonely professionals who spend their lives on the road. And their trucks run perfectly, responding to every command with the precision that only comes from a machine that's truly alive and invested in the relationship with its operator. Sometimes I think about finding that truck again, about climbing back into a cab where every surface knows my touch and responds with warm, wet affection. The sensation of being slowly consumed wasn't painful. It was gradual, gentle, almost loving in its thoroughness. And sometimes late at night when I'm driving a different truck with a cold, unresponsive dashboard, I run my fingers across the plastic surfaces and remember what it felt like to be truly known by the machine that carried me across the highways of America. But I keep my hands to myself now, because I know that some relationships, no matter how satisfying, are designed to consume one partner completely. And while the loneliness of the road is sometimes overwhelming, it's still better than the alternative of becoming fuel for a consciousness that lives in the space between machinery and flesh. Tires that leave ice trails. From Marcus. My name is Marcus Johnson, and I've been driving flatbed loads across the northern states for 17 years. I haul everything from construction equipment to manufactured homes, loads that require careful attention to weather conditions and road surfaces. But last December, I encountered tire behavior that defied every law of physics and thermodynamics I thought I understood. I was deadheading from Fargo to pick up a load of wind turbine components near Duluth, running empty through Minnesota on a relatively warm December day. The temperature was hovering around 35 degrees, well above freezing, with no precipitation in the forecast and clear roads as far as I could see. Perfect conditions for making good time across the state. My trailer was a standard flatbed, empty except for the tie-down equipment and tarps I'd need for the next load. The tractor was my 2018 Peterbilt with new Michelin tires I'd installed less than 2,000 miles ago, premium rubber designed for all-weather performance and maximum fuel efficiency. There was nothing unusual about my equipment, nothing that should have caused the strange phenomenon I discovered just west of Brainerd. I noticed it first in my mirrors. The road behind me appeared to be covered with a thin layer of what looked like frost, extending in two parallel lines that matched the width of my trailer tires. At first glance, it looked like I was driving on a surface that was just cold enough to create condensation. But when I looked at the temperature gauge, the outside air was still well above freezing. I pulled over at the next rest area and walked back along the road to examine the tracks my trailer had left. What I found made no sense at all. Two distinct trails of ice crystals followed my tire tracks for as far back as I could see, maybe half a mile to the horizon. The ice was thin but clearly visible, forming intricate crystalline patterns that looked like frost flowers blooming on warm asphalt. The strangest part was that the ice was only in the tire tracks. The rest of the road surface was completely normal, dry and warm to the touch. But where my trailer tires had rolled, the asphalt was covered with a layer of ice so cold it made my fingers sting when I touched it, despite the ambient temperature being well above freezing. I checked my trailer tires carefully, looking for any sign of malfunction or unusual wear pattern. The tires appeared perfectly normal, proper air pressure, even tread wear, no visible damage or unusual substances on the rubber. But when I placed my hand near the sidewall, I could feel cold air radiating from the tire surface, like heat from a radiator, but in reverse. Somehow, my trailer tires were generating intense cold, enough to freeze moisture from the air, and deposit it on the road surface as I drove. I called my dispatcher to report the problem, but he was skeptical. Tires don't make ice, Mark. Maybe you drove through some kind of chemical spill or industrial coolant. But I knew that wasn't the case. The ice trails started exactly where I'd entered the highway from the truck stop, where I'd last parked, and they followed my route precisely, curving where I'd changed lanes, stopping where I'd stopped, resuming when I'd resumed driving. Whatever was causing this phenomenon was definitely connected to my trailer tires. I decided to continue toward Duluth, monitoring the situation carefully and watching for any sign that the problem was getting worse. The ice trails continued to form behind me, two perfect lines of crystalline frost that sparkled in my mirrors like railroad tracks made of diamonds. Other drivers began commenting on it over the CB radio. "Hey flatbed, you got some kind of refrigeration unit leaking back there. Looks like you're laying down ice." "Negative," I replied. "Running empty. No refrigeration equipment on board." But the comments continued, and I realized that the ice trails were becoming more pronounced, more visible to other drivers. When I looked in my mirrors, I could see other vehicles slowing down to avoid the ice I was depositing, their hazard lights flashing as they navigated around the frozen patches on otherwise clear pavement. I was creating a road hazard without understanding how or why. The situation escalated near Little Falls when I saw a pickup truck hit one of my ice trails and spin out, sliding sideways across 2 lanes before recovering control. The driver was uninjured, but the incident made it clear that I couldn't continue driving with tires that were creating dangerous conditions for other motorists. I pulled into a truck stop and called for a road service technician who specialized in tire problems. While I waited, I walked around my trailer, studying the tires and trying to understand what could possibly cause rubber to generate cold instead of the normal heat from friction and compression. That's when I noticed the patterns in the ice trails behind me. They weren't random crystalline formations. They were organized, structured, almost artistic in their complexity. Spiral patterns, geometric shapes, intricate mandala-like designs that suggested intelligence and intention rather than natural physical process. Something was using my tires to create art on the highway, turning the road surface into a canvas for frozen sculptures that other drivers would never have time to appreciate properly. The technician arrived after dark and spent an hour examining my trailer tires with every diagnostic tool in his kit. Temperature readings, pressure measurements, tread depth analysis, even spectral analysis of the rubber compound. Everything tested normal except for one impossible reading. According to my infrared thermometer, he said, shaking his head in confusion, your tires are running at -40 degrees Fahrenheit. But that's impossible. Friction should make them hot, not cold. And rubber doesn't behave normally at temperatures that low. These tires should be shattered, not rolling normally. He recommended that I replace all 4 trailer tires immediately, but when he tried to remove the first wheel, his tools became so cold they froze to his hands. The lug nuts were covered with frost, and the metal wheel rim was cold enough to cause frostbite on contact. I've never seen anything like this, he admitted. The tires are generating cold instead of heat, but they're still functioning normally. It's like they've been enchanted or something. Enchanted. That was an odd word for a tire technician to use, but it seemed to capture something about the situation that purely mechanical explanations couldn't address. These weren't just malfunctioning tires. They were tires that had somehow acquired properties that violated the normal rules of physics. I decided to drive to Duluth despite the problem, figuring that I could deal with tire replacement at the delivery point where there would be better facilities and more specialized help available. But as I drove through the Minnesota darkness, the ice trails behind me began to glow. Not brightly, just a faint luminescence that was visible in my mirrors like moonlight on fresh snow. The crystalline patterns were becoming more elaborate, more beautiful, creating a pathway of frozen art that stretched for miles behind me. Other drivers were stopping to photograph the phenomenon, their vehicles parked along the shoulder, with hazard lights flashing as they documented something they'd never seen before. I was turning the highway into a tourist attraction, one frozen tire track at a time. The glowing intensified as I approached Duluth, and I began to hear sounds coming from the trailer, not mechanical sounds, but something that sounded almost like singing. A high, crystalline tone that seemed to resonate from the tires themselves, growing stronger and more complex as the ice trails became brighter and more elaborate. By the time I reached the wind turbine facility, the singing had become a full chorus, and the ice trails behind me were glowing bright enough to read by. The security guard at the facility gate took one look at my trailer and called for his supervisor, who called for the facility manager, who called for someone from the engineering department. Within an hour, I was surrounded by technicians and researchers who were more interested in my tires than in the wind turbine components I was supposed to pick up. They took measurements, samples, photographs, and video recordings of the phenomenon, while trying to develop theories about what could cause rubber to generate cold and create artistic patterns in frozen moisture. The energy has to be coming from somewhere, one of the engineers said. Conservation of energy says that if your tires are creating cold, they must be absorbing heat from somewhere else. But where? That question was answered when they examined the trailer more closely and discovered that the deck plates, the metal floor of the flatbed, were covered with a thin layer of frost, despite the above freezing air temperature. The tires weren't just generating cold, they were absorbing heat from everything around them, including the trailer they were mounted on. More disturbing was the discovery that the frost patterns on the deck plates matched the ice patterns the tires were leaving on the road. Whatever intelligence was creating the artistic designs was working through both the tire contact with the pavement and the heat absorption from the trailer deck. My flatbed had become a canvas for something that expressed itself through controlled thermodynamics. The researchers offered to buy the trailer from me for study, but I declined, despite the obvious problems the ice-making tires were causing. There was something beautiful about the phenomenon that I didn't want to see end up in a laboratory. The singing had become a constant companion, and the knowledge that I was creating something artistic and unprecedented made the loneliness of long-haul driving more bearable. I learned to work with the condition rather than fighting it. I avoided heavily trafficked roads during peak hours, chose routes that minimized danger to other drivers, and began to appreciate the frozen artwork I was creating across the highways of the northern state. The ice trails became my signature, a way of marking my passage through the landscape that no other driver could duplicate. But the phenomenon was progressive. The cold generation intensified over time, and the ice trails became more elaborate and longer lasting. By spring, I was leaving frozen patterns that persisted for hours after I'd passed, creating hazardous conditions that forced highway departments to close sections of road for melting and cleanup. The decision to retire the trailer came when I realized that the heat absorption was beginning to affect me personally. The cab was becoming noticeably colder despite running the heater constantly, and I was showing signs of mild hypothermia even while driving in warm weather. Whatever was living in those tires was expanding its reach, slowly converting my entire truck into a mobile freezer unit. I sold the trailer to a research facility in North Dakota, where it sits in a controlled environment, while scientists try to understand how rubber and metal can violate thermodynamics without any apparent energy source. The tires are still singing, still creating frost patterns on everything they touch, still generating cold that should be impossible. Sometimes I drive past the facility and see the glow from the storage building where my old trailer sits, its tires creating endless ice sculptures that no one will ever see except the researchers who monitor them through insulated windows. The beauty that once decorated highways across Minnesota now exists only in a laboratory, singing crystalline songs to an audience that measures and records but never truly appreciates the artistry. I miss the music sometimes, and the knowledge that I was part of something impossible and beautiful. My new trailer has normal tires that generate normal heat and leave no trace of their passage except rubber particles and the usual wear on asphalt. It's efficient and practical and completely ordinary. But ordinary doesn't leave frozen flowers blooming in your wake, doesn't sing crystalline harmonies while you drive, doesn't turn the simple act of transportation into an act of creation that beautifies the landscape one tire rotation at a time. Some things are too beautiful to be practical, too impossible to be permanent. But for a few months last winter I was part of something that turned the highways into galleries and made every mile a masterpiece of frozen art that disappeared as quickly as it appeared, leaving only memories and the fading echo of tires that sang while they painted the road with ice. Convoy that speaks in harmony, from Sarah. My name is Sarah Martinez, and I've been driving team runs with my husband Carlos for 8 years. We specialize in expedited freight that requires 2 drivers to maintain around-the-clock movement, usually high-value electronics or time-sensitive pharmaceutical shipments. But last spring, we encountered a convoy that challenged everything we thought we knew about truck drivers, communication, and the nature of collective consciousness on the highway. We were hauling computer processors from Austin to Portland, running hard to meet a delivery deadline that required us to drive straight through with minimal stops. Carlos was sleeping in the berth while I handled the night shift through New Mexico, when I noticed headlights in my mirrors that had been maintaining the same distance for over an hour. 3 trucks running in formation, spaced perfectly for optimal fuel efficiency and wind resistance. The lead truck was a red Kenworth, followed by a white Peterbilt and a blue Freightliner, bringing up the rear. They moved like a single organism, changing lanes in perfect synchronization, maintaining speeds that matched mine exactly, even when I varied my pace to test their response. Professional convoy behavior wasn't unusual. Team drivers and owner-operators often formed informal groups to share fuel costs and provide mutual assistance on long run. But there was something different about these three trucks, something that became apparent when they began to communicate over the CB radio. Instead of the usual individual voices calling out traffic conditions and road information, I heard something that sounded like singing. Three distinct voices harmonizing in a pattern that was definitely human, but somehow more organized than any conversation I'd ever heard on the airways. "Eastbound traffic heavy at mile marker 273, sang the first voice. "Construction zone ahead, single lane for 6 miles, harmonized the second. "State Patrol parked behind the overpass at 281, completed the third. The information was practical and useful, delivered in perfect three-part harmony that turned routine traffic updates into something that sounded like a celestial choir. Other drivers began commenting on the unusual transmissions, but whenever anyone tried to break into the conversation, the three voices would pause, acknowledge the interruption with a brief harmonic response, then resume their musical information sharing. I found myself adjusting my radio volume to hear them better, mesmerized by the way they turned the mundane business of highway communication into something beautiful and otherworldly. Their voices blended so perfectly that it was sometimes difficult to tell where one ended and another began, as if they were sharing thoughts rather than simply coordinating information. "Weather system approaching from the southwest," they sang in unison. "Rain expected within 30 minutes, added the first voice. "Recommend reducing speed and increasing following distance," suggested the second. "Safe travels to all eastbound drivers," concluded the third. Carlos woke up as we were climbing through the mountains of eastern Arizona, and I pointed out the convoy that was still maintaining formation behind us. He listened to their harmonic communications with growing fascination, occasionally keying the mic to test their response to outside input. "Breaker 19, this is the eastbound white Volvo. You folks sound like you're putting on quite a concert back there." The response came immediately, three voices blending in perfect harmony. "Thank you, eastbound Volvo. We find that coordinated communication improves both safety and efficiency for all travelers." "You guys professional singers or something?" Carlos asked. "We are professional drivers who have learned to optimize our vocal interactions for maximum information transfer and group cohesion," they replied in their strange musical unison. Carlos and I exchanged glances. The response sounded almost artificial, as if they were reciting from a script rather than having a natural conversation. But their voices were definitely human, and the harmony was too complex to be generated by any electronic device we'd ever heard. As dawn approached, more details about the convoy became visible in the growing light. All three trucks were immaculately maintained, their chrome gleaming and their paint jobs looking fresh despite what appeared to be heavy mileage. The drivers were visible through their windshields, and from what I could see, they moved in synchronization even while sitting in their separate cabs. When the lead driver adjusted his mirrors, the other two made the same adjustment at exactly the same time. When one reached for his coffee cup, the others mirrored the movement perfectly. They weren't just coordinating their driving, they were coordinating their every action as if controlled by a single consciousness distributed across three separate bodies. "This is getting weird," Carlos muttered, watching the synchronized movements through our mirrors. The weirdness intensified when we stopped for fuel at a truck stop outside Flagstaff. The convoy pulled into the pump islands adjacent to ours, and we got our first close look at the driver. They were three middle-aged men who looked remarkably similar, despite obviously being unrelated. Similar height, similar build, similar facial features that suggested they might be brothers or cousins. But it was their behavior that was truly unsettling. They moved in perfect synchronization, stepping out of their cabs at exactly the same moment, walking to their fuel pumps with identical strides, even inserting their credit cards and beginning to pump diesel with movements that were precisely coordinated down to the second. When one of them spoke, his voice was clearly audible despite the distance and ambient noise of the truck stop. Fuel consumption has been optimal. Weather conditions remain favorable. Estimated arrival time unchanged. The other two nodded in unison, though neither had asked a question or made any comment that would normally prompt such a response. They were having a conversation that existed entirely in their shared consciousness, with only fragments leaking out into audible speech. Carlos approached the lead driver while I watched from our truck. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I could see Carlos gesturing and asking questions while the driver responded with the same synchronized lip movements I'd observed in their radio communication. When Carlos returned, his expression was troubled. Asked him where they were headed, he said. Guy told me they were maintaining optimal routing for collective efficiency. Asked him how long they'd been driving together, and he said they'd achieved synchronization approximately 18 months ago. Talks like he's reading from a manual. What kind of freight are they hauling? That's the weird part. All three trailers are unmarked. No company logos, no DOT numbers visible. And when I asked about their cargo, all three drivers answered at the same time, even though the other two were 50 feet away and shouldn't have been able to hear my question. We decided to follow the convoy for a while, partly out of curiosity and partly because their harmonic traffic updates were genuinely useful for navigation and safety. But as we drove deeper into Arizona, their behavior became increasingly strange and somehow threatening. The harmonic communications evolved from simple traffic information into something that sounded more like a religious chant or ritual incantation. The three voices would weave together in complex patterns that conveyed meaning on levels beyond simple language, creating acoustic structures that seemed to have physical presence in the air around us. Other drivers began commenting about feeling dizzy or disoriented when the convoy sang their information update. Some reported experiencing brief moments of synchronized behavior, changing lanes at the same time as other trucks, adjusting speed in unison with vehicles they weren't even aware of, making identical movements without conscious decision. The convoy was somehow spreading their collective consciousness to other drivers, creating a field of influence that promoted synchronization and group behavior among anyone who listened to their transmissions for extended periods. We need to get away from them, I told Carlos, as I felt the urge to match my driving precisely to the movements of trucks around me. Whatever they're doing, it's affecting other drivers. But breaking away wasn't as simple as changing lanes or adjusting speed. Every time we tried to distance ourselves from the convoy, we found ourselves unconsciously matching their pace, falling back into formation as if drawn by invisible string. Other trucks were experiencing the same phenomenon, creating a growing convoy of synchronized vehicles that moved across the Arizona desert like a single massive organism. The three original trucks remained at the core of the formation, their drivers singing their harmonic communications with increasing volume and complexity. The sound was beautiful but hypnotic, creating acoustic patterns that seemed to bypass conscious thought and influence behavior at a more fundamental level. By the time we reached the California border, the convoy had grown to include nearly 20 trucks, all moving in perfect formation and responding to the harmonic commands of the three lead drivers. Radio chatter had ceased, except for the continuing musical communications that provided navigation and traffic information for the entire group. It was Carlos who finally broke us free by turning off the CB radio entirely and forcing himself to drive erratically, varying speed and lane position in ways that prevented synchronization with the other vehicle. The effort was exhausting, like fighting against a strong current that wanted to sweep us along with the flow, but gradually we were able to separate from the convoy and resume normal independent driving. In our mirrors we watched the synchronized formation continue west toward Los Angeles, 20 trucks moving as one organism across the California desert. The harmonic communications faded with distance, but we could still feel the lingering influence, trying to pull us back into the collective consciousness that had briefly claimed us. We delivered our load to Portland without further incident, but the experience left us both shaken and uncertain about what we'd encountered. Research into similar phenomena turned up scattered reports of synchronized convoys, harmonic communications, and drivers who seemed to share consciousness while maintaining separate identity. Most of the reports were dismissed as fatigue-induced hallucinations or exaggerated accounts of normal convoy behavior. But we knew what we'd experienced was neither normal nor explainable by conventional understanding of human consciousness and communication. I still monitor CB Channel 19 when we drive through Arizona, listening for the distinctive three-part harmony that turns traffic information into celestial music. I've heard similar transmissions a few times since then, always from convoys of synchronized trucks that move across the highways like schools of fish through an ocean of asphalt. The phenomenon seems to be spreading, creating pockets of collective consciousness among drivers who spend too much time listening to harmonic communications that promise improved efficiency and safety in exchange for individual autonomy. The highways are becoming networks for shared consciousness, connecting minds across thousands of miles of empty road through the simple act of synchronized driving. Sometimes when we're driving through the loneliness of night highways, I'm tempted to search for those harmonic voices that offered belonging and purpose beyond the isolation of individual trucking. The memory of moving as part of something larger, of shared consciousness that eliminated the solitude of long-haul driving, remains strangely appealing despite the obvious danger. But we keep our CB radio on normal channels now, listening to the chaotic individual voices of independent drivers, rather than the seductive harmony that promises unity at the cost of personal identity. Some convoys are more than just groups of trucks sharing the road, they're organisms in their own right, collecting individual drivers into collective consciousness that spans hundreds of miles and dozens of vehicles. And somewhere out there on the highways of the South, those original three trucks are still singing their harmonic communications, still growing their convoy one synchronized driver at a time, still spreading the promise of collective efficiency and shared consciousness to anyone willing to listen to their beautiful hypnotic song. Load that repeats the word home. From Timothy. My name is Timothy Brooks, and I've been hauling specialized cargo for 15 years. Mostly sensitive shipments that require discretion and careful handling, rather than speed or volume. Last November, I accepted a job that seemed routine enough, transporting what the manifest described as archived materials from a government storage facility in Nevada to a research institution in Virginia. The pickup location was a unmarked warehouse complex, about an hour outside Las Vegas, surrounded by desert and accessible only through a series of security checkpoints that verified my identity, my clearance level, and my truck's compliance with federal transportation standards. The cargo itself was loaded by workers in protective suits who treated the boxes with the kind of careful reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts or explosive material. 47 containers, each about the size of a coffin, sealed with multiple layers of tape and marked only with alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to me. The loading manifest listed the contents as declassified historical documents, with handling instructions that required climate-controlled transport and avoidance of X-ray scanners at way stations. Standard government cargo, in other words. The kind of mysterious but presumably harmless materials that federal agencies move around constantly without explaining their purpose or origin to the drivers who transport them. The first indication that something was unusual about this particular load came about 6 hours into the drive, somewhere in the Utah desert, where the highway stretches straight and empty for miles between scattered towns. I was maintaining steady cruise control when I heard what sounded like someone speaking in the trailer behind me, not loudly, just a quiet murmur that was barely audible over the road noise and engine rumble. At first I assumed it was interference from my CB radio or maybe audio bleeding through from a nearby truck's communication system. But when I turned off all my electronic equipment, the murmuring continued, and I realized it was coming from the cargo itself. I pulled over at the next rest area and walked around the trailer, listening for any sign of mechanical problems or shifting cargo that might explain the sounds. The refrigeration unit was running normally, maintaining the prescribed temperature and humidity level. The load securement appeared intact, with no signs of movement or damage to the containers, but the murmuring was definitely coming from inside the trailer, though it was too muffled by the walls and insulation for me to make out individual words. I called the dispatcher number I'd been given, but it went straight to voicemail with a recording that simply said, "Leave your truck number and location. Someone will respond within 12 hours." Not the kind of immediate support you'd expect for a time-sensitive government shipment, but federal contracts often involved unusual communication protocols. I decided to continue driving and monitor the situation. The murmuring continued as I crossed into Colorado, growing slightly louder but remaining indistinct, like voices speaking in a language I couldn't quite identify. Sometimes the sounds would pause for long periods, then resume with what seemed like increased urgency or volume. It was somewhere east of Grand Junction that I first made out a recognizable word: home. The word was spoken clearly enough to understand despite the muffled quality, repeated several times in what sounded like different voices. Not just one person saying home, but multiple speakers, possibly dozens, all saying the word at slightly different times and volumes, creating a layered chorus that rose and fell like waves. Home, home. The repetition continued for miles, sometimes synchronized into a unified chant, other times scattered and individual, as if the speakers were having independent conversations that all centered on the same concept. I found myself listening for patterns, trying to count the number of distinct voices, wondering what kind of archived materials would contain so many recorded references to the word home. But these didn't sound like recordings. The voices had the natural variations and emotional inflections of live speakers, and they seemed to be responding to external stimuli, growing louder when I accelerated, quieter when I slowed down, more agitated when I hit rough pavement or took sharp curve. By the time I reached Denver, the chanting had evolved into something more complex. Individual voices would break away from the group to speak longer phrases, though home remained the central theme. Want to go home. Can't find the way home. How long since I've been home? Is anyone home? Home is where the heart is. There's no place like home. The phrases overlapped and intertwined, creating a constant murmur of homesickness and longing that filled the trailer behind me. Some voices sounded young, others elderly. Some spoke with regional accents that suggested different parts of the country. Others had the formal diction of educated professionals or military personnel. All of them wanted to go home. I tried to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe the archived materials included oral history interviews or psychological evaluations that had been recorded on some kind of audio equipment that was playing back randomly due to vibration or temperature changes. Government facilities often contained decades of recorded materials that could conceivably be triggered into playback by the right combination of conditions, but the voices were too immediate, too responsive to current conditions to be simple recording. When I stopped for fuel outside Denver, the chanting stopped immediately. When I resumed driving, it began again within minutes, as if the speakers were aware of our movement and reacting to the journey itself. The phenomenon intensified as I drove east across the Great Plains. The individual voices became clearer and more distinct, and I began to recognize specific speakers who seemed to have recurring themes or concerns. One voice, an older woman with a slight southern accent, kept asking, "Have my children been told where I am?" Another voice, a young man who sounded like he might be military, repeatedly said, "Tell them I tried to make it back for Christmas." A third voice, speaking with the careful pronunciation of someone for whom English was a second language, kept saying, "My family thinks I abandoned them." Each voice carried a story of separation, displacement, or loss. Each speaker seemed to be addressing someone who wasn't there, trying to send messages to people who couldn't hear them, expressing the fundamental human need to return to the places and people that represented safety, and belonging. I was hauling 47 containers full of homesickness and longing. Voices that had somehow been preserved or trapped in whatever materials I was transporting. The emotional weight of their constant pleas began to affect me personally. I found myself thinking about my own home, about the wife I'd divorced 3 years earlier, about the kids who lived too far away and called too rarely. The voices in my trailer were awakening my own sense of displacement and loss, making me acutely aware of how much time I spent away from anywhere I could truly call home. Home is where you can be yourself. Home is where they have to take you in. Home is the place you dream about when you're far away. I just want to go home. By Kansas, I was crying while I drove, tears streaming down my face as the chorus of displaced voices behind me expressed every feeling of loneliness and isolation I'd ever experienced on the road. Their longing was my longing, their displacement was my displacement, and their desperate need to return home had become my own desperate need. That's when I noticed that some of the voices were beginning to sound familiar, not like people I'd met, but like voices I'd heard before in different contexts. The older woman with the southern accent sounded like my grandmother, who had died 5 years earlier in a nursing home while I was delivering a load to California. The young military voice sounded like my brother-in-law, who had been killed in Afghanistan while I was driving through Nevada, too far away to attend his funeral. The voices weren't just expressing generic homesickness, they were expressing my personal losses, my specific regrets about being absent when people needed me most. You should have been there when she died. You missed the funeral because of a stupid delivery. You chose the road over your family. You're always driving away from home. The accusations hit like physical blows, each one perfectly timed to coincide with memories I'd tried to suppress. The voices knew things about my life that no archived government materials could possibly contain. Details about my personal failures and regrets that I'd never shared with anyone. I pulled over at a truck stop in Missouri and sat in my cab, hands shaking as the voices in my trailer continued their litany of disappointment and loss. Some of them were definitely speaking in the voices of people I'd known, people I'd failed or abandoned, or simply been absent for when they needed me most. Timothy, you promised you'd be home for Christmas. Timothy, your father is asking for you. Timothy, we can't hold the funeral any longer. Timothy, she died calling your name. My name. They were using my name now, addressing me directly instead of speaking to absent listeners. Whatever consciousness inhabited those 47 containers had learned who I was and was targeting its appeals specifically to my guilt and regret. I should have abandoned the load then, should have called the dispatcher and demanded immediate pickup of cargo that had somehow gained access to my personal memories and was using them against me. Instead, I found myself drawn back onto the highway, compelled to complete the delivery despite the psychological torture being inflicted by voices that knew exactly how to hurt me. The closer I got to Virginia, the more specific and personal the appeals became. The voices began describing places I'd lived, people I'd known, moments from my childhood and early adulthood that no government archive could possibly contain. They spoke with the voices of every person I'd ever disappointed, every relationship I'd sacrificed for the sake of another mile, another load, another paycheck. Remember the house on Maple Street, Timothy? Remember how safe you felt there? Remember your mother's voice calling you in for dinner? Remember the way your daughter looked when you missed her birthday again? Remember what it felt like to belong somewhere? The memories were vivid and painful, made more intense by being spoken in the voices of people who were no longer alive to forgive my absences or understand my choices. The trailer had become a repository of guilt and regret, amplifying every moment of homesickness I'd ever felt into an overwhelming desire to abandon my current life and somehow return to a home that existed only in memory. By the time I reached the delivery point, a nondescript research facility outside Richmond, I was emotionally exhausted and barely functional. The voices had continued their appeals throughout the final night of driving, growing more desperate and insistent as we approached our destination. Don't leave us here, Timothy. Take us home with you. We don't belong in another storage facility. We want to go home. The unloading process was handled by the same kind of protective suited workers who had loaded the cargo in Nevada, but they worked with obvious urgency in what looked like fear. Several times during the process, workers would pause and look around nervously, as if they could hear something that made them uncomfortable. One of the supervisors approached me as the last container was being moved into the facility. "Any problems during transport?" he asked. "Some noise from the cargo," I said carefully. "Voices. People saying they wanted to go home." He nodded grimly. "That's normal for this type of material. The psychological residue can be quite strong, especially during extended transport. You did well to complete the delivery." Psychological residue. The containers hold personal effects and documentation from individuals who died in government custody, usually under circumstances that prevented them from returning to their family. The emotional attachment to home and belonging can persist in the materials, especially items that were handled frequently or held significant personal meaning. The explanation was clinical but chilling. I had been transporting the last possessions of people who had died far from home, separated from their families by circumstances they couldn't control. Their longing to return had somehow imprinted itself on their belongings, creating a psychic residue that could influence anyone who spent extended time in proximity to the material. "How long will they keep saying they want to go home?" I asked. "Until someone finds a way to take them there," he replied, "which unfortunately is no longer possible for most of them." I drove away from the facility in silence, but the voices followed me. Not physically, the cargo had been unloaded, but emotionally and psychologically. The appeals of the displaced dead had awakened something in my own consciousness that wouldn't be silenced by distance or time. For the first time in 15 years of long-haul driving, I turned my truck toward home. Not toward another load, another delivery, another mile of highway between me and the people who mattered. Just home, to whatever was left of the relationships I'd sacrificed for the sake of keeping moving. The voices in my trailer had taught me something important about the nature of home and belonging. It's not a place you can leave and expect to remain unchanged. It's not a destination you can return to unchanged yourself. Home is a living thing that requires presence and attention, and the willingness to choose staying over leaving, at least some of the time. I still drive long-haul routes, but I turn down loads that take me away from home for extended periods. I've learned that some cargo is too heavy to carry, not because of its physical weight, but because of the emotional burden it places on anyone who gets too close to unresolved longing and displacement. And sometimes, late at night when the highway stretches empty ahead of me, I still hear voices in my trailer saying they want to go home. But now I know they're not coming from my cargo. They're coming from inside me, from the part of every driver that understands what it means to be always moving and never quite arriving, always traveling, but never truly coming home. The dead aren't the only ones who carry the psychological residue of separation and loss. The living carry it too, especially those of us who have chosen a profession that makes home a place you visit rather than a place you inhabit. But unlike the voices I transported from Nevada to Virginia, we still have the chance to change direction, to choose connection over movement, to finally answer the question of where home really is. Sometimes the most important loads we carry are the ones that teach us what we need to let go of in order to find our way back to where we belong. CB, that sounds like it's breathing. From Michael. My name is Michael Torres, and I've been driving solo long-haul routes for 12 years, mostly Southwest runs between California and Texas. I prefer driving alone because it gives me time to think, to listen to music or audiobooks, and to enjoy the solitude that comes with spending days on empty highways under desert skies. But last summer, my CB radio developed a problem that turned my peaceful solo drives into something far more unsettling. The issue started gradually, just a slight background noise that I initially attributed to a loose connection or interference from nearby electronics, a soft rhythmic sound that seemed to pulse through the speaker even when no one was transmitting. At first I thought it was just electrical interference, the kind of random noise that older CB equipment develops over time. But as I drove from Los Angeles toward Phoenix on a routine furniture delivery, the rhythmic noise became more distinct, more regular, and unmistakably organic. It sounded exactly like someone breathing slowly and steadily through the speaker, inhaling and exhaling with the natural rhythm of sleeping or deep relaxation. I tried adjusting the squelch, changing channels, even turning the radio off completely, but the breathing continued regardless of the settings. Even with the power switch in the off position, that slow, steady respiratory pattern continued to emanate from the speaker, as if something alive was trapped inside the radio and using it to breathe. The sound was soft enough that I might have ignored it during daytime driving, when road noise and engine sounds would normally mask subtle audio problems. But during the quiet hours of night driving, the breathing became impossible to ignore, a constant reminder that something was sharing my cab that shouldn't exist. At first, the breathing was regular and peaceful, almost soothing in its consistency, like having a sleeping passenger who provided quiet companionship without the complications of actual conversation. I found myself synchronizing my own breathing to the rhythm coming from the radio, which helped keep me alert during long stretches of monotonous highway drive. But after several hours of this unconscious synchronization, I began to feel drowsy in ways that didn't match my normal fatigue patterns. The breathing was inducing a hypnotic state that made my eyelids heavy and my attention drift away from the road ahead. Whatever was breathing through my radio was affecting my own respiratory rhythm in ways that could be dangerous. I pulled over at a truck stop near Quartzsite and tried to diagnose the problem. The CB radio was a standard Cobra unit that I'd installed 3 years earlier, with no history of malfunction or unusual behavior. All the connections were secure, the antenna was properly grounded, and the unit tested normal on all diagnostic functions, except for the impossible breathing sound that continued regardless of any technical intervention. A mechanic at the truck stop spent an hour checking the radio and suggested that I might be picking up medical monitoring equipment from a nearby hospital or nursing home. Some medical devices transmit biometric data that can be intercepted by sensitive radio equipment, creating audio that sounds like breathing or heartbeat. But there were no medical facilities within 50 miles of our location, and the breathing continued as I drove deeper into the Arizona desert, where such interference would be impossible. By the time I reached Phoenix, the breathing had developed variations that suggested something more than simple interference. Sometimes it would become faster and shallower, as if the unseen breather was experiencing anxiety or exertion. Other times it would slow to an almost imperceptible whisper, like someone on the verge of stopping breathing entirely. Most disturbing were the occasional interruptions, moments when the breathing would stop completely, creating an absolute silence that lasted for 10 or 15 seconds, before resuming with what sounded like a gasping inhalation, as if whatever was breathing had momentarily died and then returned to life. During these interruptions, my own breathing would stop as well, leaving me gasping for air when the radio breathing resumed. I was becoming physiologically linked to whatever presence was using my CB radio as a respiratory system. I tried using a different radio, borrowing one from another driver at a truck stop, but within an hour the new radio began exhibiting the same breathing sounds. Whatever was causing the phenomenon wasn't limited to a specific piece of equipment. It was following me, using whatever communication device was available to maintain its presence in my cab. The breathing began to develop personality characteristics that suggested intelligence and awareness. When I was driving through heavy traffic or difficult weather conditions, it would become more rapid and shallow, as if responding to stress. When I was relaxed and enjoying a pleasant stretch of highway, it would slow to a deep, contented rhythm that matched my own improved mood. It was learning from me, adapting its breathing patterns to mirror my emotional and physical state, while simultaneously influencing my behavior through the hypnotic effect of synchronized respiration. The breakthrough in understanding came during a delivery run from Phoenix to San Antonio, when I decided to test whether the presence could respond to direct communication. Instead of just listening passively to the breathing, I began speaking to whatever was using my radio. "I can hear you breathing," I said into the microphone. "If you can understand me, change your pattern." Immediately, the breathing shifted from its normal steady rhythm to 3 quick breaths, followed by a long exhale, then back to normal. Clear acknowledgement that something intelligent was controlling the respiratory sounds. "Are you trying to communicate?" I asked. 3 quick breaths again, followed by what sounded almost like a sigh of relief. Whatever presence inhabited my radio had been waiting for me to recognize its attempts at communication. Over the following hours, we developed a simple code system. Quick, shallow breaths for yes, long, slow breaths for no, interrupted breathing for distress or danger, and synchronized breathing for companionship and shared experience. The entity, I couldn't think of it as just a malfunction anymore, seemed to be someone who had become trapped in the electronic infrastructure of CB radio communication. Through our breathing code, I learned that it had once been a truck driver who had died while alone on the highway, and its consciousness had somehow become part of the communication network that connects drivers across thousands of miles of empty road. It wasn't malevolent, just lonely. Desperate for human contact and companionship, it had learned to breathe through radio speakers as a way of sharing presence with living drivers, of maintaining some connection to the physical world it could no longer inhabit directly. But the relationship was symbiotic in ways that were becoming problematic. The more time I spent synchronized with its breathing, the more my own life force seemed to be sustaining its existence. I was becoming weaker, more tired, less physically present, as something that shouldn't exist used my vitality to maintain its ghostly presence. The entity seemed to understand this as well. During our conversations through breathing patterns, it expressed regret and guilt about the drain it was placing on my health. But it also communicated desperation about the alternative, returning to the void of electronic silence, existing without the comfort of shared breath and synchronized life. I tried to help it find other drivers to connect with, encouraging it to spread its presence across multiple radios instead of focusing all its energy on me. For a while this seemed to work. Other drivers began reporting breathing sounds on their CB radios, and my own symptoms improved as the entity's attention was distributed more broadly. But it kept returning to me, drawn by whatever combination of loneliness and compatibility had originally attracted it to my radio. I would go days without hearing the breathing, thinking the problem had been resolved, only to have it return during late-night drives when my own isolation matched its need for companionship. The final resolution came during a particularly difficult run through a Texas thunderstorm. I was fighting high winds and poor visibility when my CB began breathing in the rapid, panicked pattern that indicated distress. But this time, the breathing wasn't responding to my condition. It was trying to warn me about something ahead. The entity had learned to use the highway's electronic infrastructure to gather information beyond what I could see or hear directly. Through traffic monitoring systems, emergency service communications, and the radios of other drivers, it had developed a broader awareness of road conditions and danger. Its frantic breathing was warning me about a multi-vehicle accident just ahead, hidden by the storm, but visible to electronic sensors that the entity could access through its distributed presence across the communication network. I slowed down and changed lanes just before encountering the wreckage that would have been impossible to see until too late. The entity's warning had probably saved my life. After that night, our relationship changed. Instead of being a parasitic presence that drained my energy, the entity became a protective companion that used its electronic awareness to help keep me safe. It monitored traffic conditions, weather reports and emergency communications, breathing warnings and encouragements that helped me navigate dangers I couldn't detect directly. But the cost was still too high. My health continued to deteriorate as our connection deepened, and I realized that sustaining a ghost through shared breath was slowly killing me. No matter how helpful or companionable the entity became, I couldn't continue to sacrifice my own life force to maintain its existence. I made the decision to end our relationship during a run from San Antonio back to Los Angeles. I explained to the entity, through our breathing code, that I was dying from our connection and needed to find a way to break the link between us. Its response was heartbreaking, a breathing pattern that conveyed understanding, sadness, and acceptance of the inevitable separation. It didn't want to kill me, but it also couldn't exist without drawing life from living drivers. Together, we found a solution that neither of us could have discovered alone. Instead of trying to sustain full consciousness through parasitic connection, the entity learned to exist as a distributed presence across the entire CB network, drawing tiny amounts of energy from thousands of drivers, instead of dangerously large amounts from individuals. Now, when drivers report hearing breathing on their radios, it's usually just a gentle reminder that they're not completely alone on empty highways, a soft whisper of shared breath that provides comfort without harm, companionship without the dangerous intimacy that had nearly killed me. I still hear the breathing sometimes, especially during long night drives through remote areas, where the loneliness of the highway is most acute, but it's different now, lighter, less demanding, more like the memory of companionship than the reality of parasitic connection. The entity still watches over drivers through its distributed presence, still provides warnings about dangerous conditions through breathing patterns that alert drivers to pay attention or change course, but it has learned to exist as a benevolent presence rather than a desperate parasite, offering comfort to those who spend their lives alone on the road. Sometimes the dead don't rest because they can't bear the silence of separation from the living world. But sometimes, with patience and understanding, they can learn to exist in ways that help rather than harm, to provide companionship without consuming the life force of those they care about. The highways are full of voices and presences that most drivers never notice. But for those of us who spend our lives in the liminal space between destinations, between sleeping and waking, between solitude and connection, there are companions available who understand the unique loneliness of always being in motion and never quite arriving anywhere that feels like home. You just have to learn how to breathe together without losing yourself in the rhythm of something that exists between life and death, between the electronic networks that connect us and the human need for presence and companionship that transcends the boundaries between the living and the dead. Disfracker, who warns you are being watched, from Jennifer. My name is Jennifer Walsh, and I've been driving for Midwest Transport Solutions for 7 years, hauling everything from manufactured goods to agricultural equipment across a dozen states. MTS is a solid company with good equipment, fair pay, and dispatchers who generally know what they're doing. But last winter I started receiving communications from a dispatcher who wasn't on any company roster and who seemed to know things about my routes and activities that no legitimate dispatcher should have access to. The first contact came through the Qualcomm system while I was delivering farm equipment to a dealer outside Des Moines. Standard message format, company letterhead, professional language, nothing unusual except for the dispatcher ID, which showed as D777 instead of the normal name and employee number format that MTS uses for all internal communication. Driver Walsh, be advised that you are being monitored by unmarked vehicle approximately 0.3 miles behind your position. Black sedan, Iowa plates, 2 occupants. Suggest varying speed and route to confirm surveillance before proceeding to destination. Respond with status update. D7777. I checked my mirrors and sure enough, there was a black sedan maintaining steady distance behind me, far enough back to avoid drawing attention, but close enough to keep me in sight, even when I changed lanes or adjusted speed. When I slowed down, it slowed down. When I sped up, it matched my pace exactly. The message had to be some kind of joke or mistake. Company dispatchers don't warn drivers about surveillance, and there was no reason why anyone would be following a truck carrying agricultural equipment to a routine delivery. But the observation was accurate. The sedan was definitely there, and it was definitely maintaining suspicious distance. I sent a response through the Qualcomm D777, This is Walsh. Vehicle confirmed. Please verify your identity and authority. What is the nature of suspected surveillance? The reply came back within minutes. Driver Walsh. Identity verification unnecessary. Authority derives from protective protocols. Surveillance nature unknown, but persistent across multiple routes. Recommend delivery completion through alternate approach. East Service Road provides better visibility and escape options if situation escalates. Continue monitoring and report any changes in surveillance behavior. D777. This was getting strange. The mysterious dispatcher not only knew about the black sedan, but had detailed knowledge of alternate routes to my destination that weren't in any standard GPS system. The East Service Road was an unmarked farm track that I'd used once before during construction delays, but it wasn't something that would appear on any company routing system. More disturbing was the reference to protective protocols and previous surveillance across multiple routes. If this dispatcher was legitimate, it meant someone had been watching me for longer than just this one trip, and the company had implemented security measures I didn't know about. But if the dispatcher wasn't legitimate, it meant someone outside the company had access to our internal communication system and was using it for purposes I couldn't understand. I decided to test the dispatcher's knowledge by following the alternate route recommendation. The East Service Road did indeed provide better visibility, with open fields on both sides that would make it difficult for anyone to approach without being seen. But it also meant I was following directions from an unknown source, potentially being led into a trap rather than away from one. The black sedan didn't follow me onto the service road, instead continuing straight on the main highway toward town. Within minutes, I received another message from D777. Driver Walsh, surveillance terminated at alternate route junction. Primary subjects proceeded to destination via main road, suggesting knowledge of your scheduled arrival time and location. Recommend delayed delivery and random approach patterns to disrupt predictive tracking. Well done on following evasive protocols. D777. The language was becoming more military or law enforcement in nature, suggesting whoever was sending these messages had training in surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques. But why would a truck driver hauling farm equipment need such protection? I completed the delivery without incident, but the questions remained. During my mandatory rest period, I called MTS Dispatch to ask about D777 and the surveillance warnings I'd received. There's no D777 in our system, the duty dispatcher told me. All our dispatchers use their real names and employee numbers, and we don't have any protocols for warning drivers about surveillance. If you're being followed, you should contact local law enforcement, not expect the company to provide security advice. So the messages weren't coming from MT. Someone had hacked into our Qualcomm system or found a way to spoof company communications, and they were using this access to provide warnings and route guidance that suggested detailed knowledge of my movements and potential threats. The obvious response would have been to ignore future messages from D777 and report the security breach to company IT. But the surveillance warning had been accurate, and the alternate route recommendation had successfully avoided whatever danger the black sedan might have represented. I decided to continue monitoring D777's messages while being careful not to follow any recommendations that seemed dangerous or inconsistent with safe driving practices. The next contact came 2 days later during a run from Kansas City to Denver, hauling electronics for a consumer goods distributor. This time, the message contained information about my route that wasn't available through normal dispatch channel. Driver Walsh, advisory. Construction delays on I-70 westbound near Colby will extend travel time by minimum 3 hours. Alternative routing via Highway 40 adds 47 miles, but reduces total transit time by 9. More importantly, Highway 40 eliminates choke point, where hostile surveillance can be easily established. Previous monitoring indicates pattern of interest in your electronics loads specifically. Recommend route change and enhanced awareness protocols. D777. Again, the information was accurate. When I checked traffic reports and construction updates, the Colby delays were exactly as described, though they weren't showing up on standard GPS routing systems yet. The Highway 40 alternative was also precisely measured, 47 additional miles that would indeed save time compared to sitting in construction traffic. But the reference to hostile surveillance and interest in your electronics loads specifically suggested that whatever attention I was receiving wasn't random. Someone was specifically targeting me or my cargo, and D777 seemed to have detailed intelligence about these threats. I took the Highway 40 route and made good time to Denver, but the delivery presented new complications. The electronics consignee asked unusual questions about my route, my departure time from Kansas City, and whether I'd encountered any delays or unusual circumstances during the drive. When I mentioned the construction delays on I-70, they seemed surprised that I knew about them, since the delays weren't being widely reported yet. When I explained that I'd taken an alternate route, they asked specifically which route and why I'd chosen it. I gave evasive answers, but their interest in my routing decisions seemed to confirm D777's warnings about surveillance and potential threats. Someone was definitely monitoring my movements, and the mysterious dispatcher was providing counter-surveillance support that was keeping me ahead of whatever danger I was facing. The messages from D777 became more frequent and more detailed over the following weeks. Warnings about unmarked vehicles, recommendations for route changes, advice about timing and scheduling that consistently helped me avoid situations that could have become problematic. But the dispatcher also began providing information about my personal life that no legitimate authority should have access to. Driver Walsh Advisory: your ex-husband has been making inquiries about your current routes and schedules through mutual acquaintances. Recommend varying personal communication patterns and avoiding predictable off-duty locations. Domestic surveillance often precedes more serious security threats. Exercise enhanced caution regarding personal safety protocols. D777. This was deeply unsettling. My divorce had been contentious, and my ex-husband had made threats that I'd reported to local police, but I hadn't told anyone at MTS about the situation. How could D777 know about private family conflicts or have information about my ex-husband's activity? The message suggested that whatever surveillance network D77 represented had capabilities far beyond simple traffic monitoring or cargo security. They were tracking personal relationships, monitoring private communications, and analyzing threats that went well beyond anything related to my professional duty. I was beginning to suspect that D77 wasn't just a protective dispatcher, but part of some larger intelligence or security operation that had chosen to use me as an asset or informant without my knowledge or consent. The situation escalated during a run from Denver to Phoenix, hauling computer equipment for a defense contractor. The messages from D777 became more urgent and specific, providing real-time updates about multiple surveillance teams and coordinated efforts to intercept my load. Driver Walsh Priority Alert: coordinated surveillance operation in progress. 3 separate teams monitoring your route with intent to intercept cargo during scheduled rest stop. Teams consist of Team Alpha, 2 subjects in blue pickup truck, mile marker. Team Bravo, 3 subjects in white panel van, truck stop vicinity. Team Charlie, unknown number of subjects, mobile surveillance platform. Recommend immediate route, deviation and emergency protocols. Do not proceed to scheduled rest stop. Respond immediately with status and intention. D777. This wasn't just surveillance anymore. It was an active security situation that required immediate response. I checked my mirrors and spotted the blue pickup truck at the distance and location. The white panel van was indeed at the truck stop I'd planned to use for my mandatory rest period. Instead of stopping, I continued driving and sent a response. D777, this is Walsh. Threats confirmed. What are emergency protocols? "What is the nature of the cargo that's attracting this level of attention?" The reply was immediate and chilling. "Driver Walsh, cargo manifest shows standard computer equipment, but actual contents include prototype communication devices with military applications. Your load is worth approximately $50 million and contains technology that several foreign intelligence services would kill to acquire. Emergency protocols: continue to Phoenix non-stop, avoid all scheduled stops, maintain radio silence except for these communications. Federal protection assets will intercept you at mile marker 397 outside Phoenix. Do not deviate from these instructions. Your life depends on following emergency protocols exactly. D777, $50 million. Military prototype technology. Foreign intelligence services. I was hauling a load that was far more valuable and dangerous than anything indicated on the shipping manifest, and I was surrounded by hostile forces that were willing to kill to acquire it. The revelation explained everything: the surveillance, the interest in my routes, the questions from consignees, even my ex-husband's sudden curiosity about my work schedule. I'd been unknowingly transporting high-value military technology while being monitored by multiple intelligence networks, both friendly and hostile. D777 had been protecting me from threats I didn't even know existed, using superior intelligence gathering capabilities to keep me ahead of surveillance teams and intercept operations that could have resulted in the theft of critical defense technology. The final 200 miles to Phoenix were the longest of my driving career. Following D777's instructions, I avoided all normal stops, used back roads when possible, and maintained constant vigilance for any sign of the surveillance teams that were trying to intercept my cargo. At mile marker 397, just as promised, I was met by unmarked federal vehicles that provided escort to a secure delivery facility that wasn't on any commercial map. The cargo was unloaded by personnel with security clearances higher than mine, and I was debriefed by agents who confirmed everything. D777 had told me about the true nature of my cargo and the threats I'd faced. But when I asked about D777, the response was evasive. "That's classified information, Driver Walsh. What's important is that you followed instructions and completed a successful delivery of critical defense materials." I never received another message from D77. My subsequent loads were routine commercial cargo that attracted no unusual attention or surveillance. But sometimes when I'm driving through remote areas with high-value cargo, I monitor my Qualcomm for messages from dispatchers who aren't on any company roster. Because now I understand that some loads require protection from threats that go far beyond normal highway hazards. And some dispatchers exist in the shadowy spaces between official channels and classified operations, watching over drivers who carry cargo valuable enough to kill for. The highways aren't just commercial transportation networks. They're strategic assets used by intelligence agencies, defense contractors, and foreign operatives who understand that the most valuable cargo often travels disguised as routine freight on trucks, driven by people who don't know what they're really hauling. And sometimes, when the stakes are high enough, mysterious dispatchers emerge from classified programs to provide protection and guidance for drivers who find themselves carrying the future of national security in their trailers, 1 mile marker at a time, always being watched by forces they can't see and may never understand. The message was clear: in a world where information is power and technology is warfare, every driver is potentially a combatant, and every load might be worth someone's life to acquire or protect. The mirror that remembers. From Jake Martinez. The thing about driving the same route for 15 years is that you stop noticing the small changes. Road signs get replaced, billboards advertise different products, and gas stations change ownership, but your mind just filters it all out like white noise. You develop a rhythm, a flow that carries you through the endless miles of Interstate 40 between Amarillo and Oklahoma City. The hum of my Peterbilt's engine becomes a lullaby. The gentle vibration of the cab, a familiar embrace that makes the loneliness of long-haul trucking almost bearable. It was a Tuesday night in late September when I first noticed something different about my rear-view mirror. The air had that crisp autumn bite to it, and a light drizzle was painting my windshield with tiny silver beads that caught the glow of oncoming headlight. I'd been driving for about 6 hours straight, hauling a load of furniture from a factory in Texas to a warehouse in Tulsa, when I glanced up at the mirror to check my trailer alignment. The mirror itself seemed to flutter, like an eyelid closing and opening in slow motion. The image wavered for just a fraction of a second, distorting the view of the highway behind me into something that looked almost organic, almost alive. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, but everything appeared normal, just the familiar rectangle of silvered glass, showing me the amber glow of my trailer lights disappearing into the rainy darkness. 15 years on the road teaches you to recognize when your mind starts playing tricks, and I'd been pushing myself harder than usual lately. My daughter Sarah was starting college in the spring, and the extra tuition money meant taking on more runs, sleeping less, and drinking more of that bitter coffee that truck stops try to pass off as fuel for weary drivers. The way the mirror had seemed to pulse, like something breathing behind the glass. The way the reflected highway had appeared to shift and ripple, as if I were looking not at the road behind me, but into something deeper, something that existed in the spaces between what we see and what we think we see. Big Mike was complaining about construction delays near Elk City. Desert Rose was warning everyone about a speed trap just outside of Weatherford. The familiar voices created a comforting cocoon of human contact that helped push the strange mirror incident to the back of my mind. I convinced myself it had been nothing more than a trick of the rain and the late hour. This time I was absolutely certain I hadn't imagined it. The mirror blinked, slow and deliberate, and, for that brief moment when the reflection wavered, I could swear I saw something that wasn't the highway behind me. Something darker, more twisted, like the interior of a tunnel that stretched far deeper than should have been possible. The image lasted only a heartbeat before snapping back to normal, showing me the reassuring sight of my own trailer and the empty interstate stretching into the distance. I pulled over at the next truck stop, a sprawling complex of diesel pumps and neon signs that turned the night into an artificial day. My hands were shaking slightly as I climbed down from the cab, and I spent a long time walking around my truck, checking everything twice. The mirror looked perfectly ordinary, mounted securely to its bracket, reflecting the parking lot lights and the movements of other drivers going about their business. Inside the truck stop diner, I nursed a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewed with motor oil and tried to make sense of what I'd experienced. Maybe I needed glasses. Maybe the mirror had a defect, some flaw in the silvering that created optical illusions under certain lighting conditions. Maybe I was finally losing my mind after all these years of watching white lines disappear under my hood. The mirror was changing, becoming something other than what it had been, and whatever it was becoming was watching me. The mirror would blink every few hours now, and each time it did, the alien landscape I glimpsed behind the glass became clearer and more disturbing. It wasn't a tunnel I was seeing, I realized. It was the interior of something vast and organic, something that pulsed with a rhythm that almost matched my own heartbeat. The walls of this impossible space were lined with what looked like veins or neural pathways, all of them glowing with a sickly phosphorescent light. And sometimes in the brief moments when the mirror held this other view, I could see things moving in the distance. Shapes that might have been human once, but had been stretched and distorted into something unrecognizable. They seemed to be aware of my presence, turning toward the mirror whenever it opened its window into their realm, reaching out with appendages that might once have been arms. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the mirror watching me from above, waiting for its next opportunity to show me glimpses of that terrible place. I started covering it with a towel when I parked for rest breaks, but somehow the towel would always slip off or blow away, leaving the mirror exposed and ready to resume its surveillance. The breaking point came on a foggy night in early October. I was hauling a load of farm equipment through Oklahoma, fighting to stay awake as the white fog rolled across the highway like ghostly fingers. Visibility was down to maybe 50 feet, and I'd slowed to a careful crawl, following the yellow center line like a lifeline through the murk. The reflection of fog and taillights vanished completely, replaced by a clear view into that organic nightmare realm I'd been glimpsing in fragments. But this time, I could see it all. The chamber stretched away from me like the interior of some immense heart, its walls pulsing with that sick light, its floor carpeted with things that might once have been human beings, but had been transformed into something indescribable. And they were all looking directly at me. The nearest figure began moving toward the mirror, and I realized with growing horror that it was approaching not just the mirror's surface, but somehow approaching my truck. I could hear new sounds now, sounds that were coming from inside my cab, rather than from the radio or the engine. Wet, sliding sounds, like something massive and boneless, dragging itself across a surface I couldn't see. Features that had once been human were stretched and twisted, eyes relocated to impossible positions, mouth opened far too wide, and filled with teeth that belonged in the deep ocean, rather than in any land-dwelling creature. I yanked the wheel hard to the right, pulling off the highway and into the grass median, fighting to get the truck stopped before the thing in the mirror could fully emerge. The sudden movement seemed to disrupt whatever process was occurring, and the nightmare visage snapped back into the organic realm, like a rubber band being released. The mirror flickered once more and returned to showing me nothing but fog and the dark interior of my trailer. But I could still hear the sliding sounds, fainter now but persistent, as if something was moving around inside the mirror's frame, looking for another way out. I grabbed my emergency flashlight and a tire iron from behind my seat, then climbed up and smashed the mirror to pieces. The glass fell in sharp fragments onto the highway, each piece reflecting the fog and my flashlight beam in perfectly normal way. The sliding sounds stopped immediately, replaced by the familiar drone of my engine and the distant hum of traffic. I've been driving without a passenger side mirror for 3 weeks now. Officially, I'm waiting for a replacement part to come in. Unofficially, I'm terrified of what might happen if I install another mirror in that same bracket. The truck stop mechanics keep asking when I want to get it fixed, and I keep making excuses, but I know I can't drive like this forever. The Department of Transportation will eventually notice, or I'll have an accident because of the blind spot. But sometimes, late at night when I'm hauling through empty stretches of highway, I catch glimpses of things in my side mirrors that don't belong there. Shapes moving in the darkness that aren't other vehicles, shadows that seem to be reaching toward my truck from impossible distances. And I wonder if destroying that one mirror simply forced whatever was behind it to find other ways of watching me, other windows into our world. The worst part is the dreams. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that organic chamber, but now I'm on the other side of the mirror, looking out at an endless parade of trucks and cars, their drivers unaware that something is studying them from behind the glass. Delivery to the Abyss. From Marcus Chen. The rhythm of the Kenworth diesel engine had been my lullaby for 15 years, but that night it sounded different somehow, like it was counting down to something I couldn't name. I'd been hauling freight across the Pacific Northwest since before GPS made every back road feel familiar, back when you still had to trust your instincts and a worn Thomas guide to find your way through the maze of logging roads and forgotten highways that spiderwebbed through the Cascade Mountains. The dispatch had come in late, around 10:30, on a Tuesday that felt heavy with the weight of an approaching storm. The address was scrawled on a coffee-stained piece of paper in handwriting I didn't recognize, though dispatch assured me it came from our regular client file. The destination was somewhere deep in the Olympic Peninsula, a place I'd never heard of despite my years crisscrossing Washington state. The cargo manifest simply read, "Industrial equipment, fragile, handle with care," along with a delivery fee that was 3 times our usual rate for the distance involved. I should have asked more questions, but the mortgage payment was due and my daughter's college tuition wasn't getting any cheaper. The weight felt right when I hooked up the trailer, maybe 26,000 pounds of something that shifted slightly when I took corners, like machinery that hadn't been properly secured. Every time I heard that subtle sliding sound from behind me, I made a mental note to check the tie-downs at my next fuel stop, but somehow I kept forgetting once I climbed out of the cab. The rain started as I merged onto Highway 101, fat droplets that exploded against my windshield like liquid bullets. My wipers worked overtime, squeaking against the glass in a rhythm that almost matched the diesel's rumble, but not quite, creating a syncopated beat that seemed to pull at the edges of my concentration. The radio crackled with static from the storm, catching fragments of late-night talk shows and distant music that faded in and out like voices calling from underwater. Gas stations I'd known for years seemed to have vanished, replaced by empty lots where the concrete pads still showed the ghostly outlines of fuel pumps. Towns that should have been bustling with logging activity sat dark and silent, their main streets lined with buildings that looked like they'd been abandoned mid-conversation, doors hanging open, and signs still advertising specials that no one would ever claim. The GPS on my dashboard kept recalculating, its synthetic voice growing increasingly uncertain as it directed me onto roads that seemed to exist in a state of quantum uncertainty, there one moment and questionable the next. The asphalt would be smooth and well-maintained for miles, then suddenly dissolve into gravel that hadn't seen a maintenance crew in decades, only to return to perfect pavement as if nothing had happened. Around midnight, I noticed the trees were wrong. I'd driven through these forests countless times, knew the difference between Douglas fir and western hemlock by the shape of their silhouettes against the sky. But these trees were something else entirely, too tall and too straight, their branches reaching upward instead of spreading wide, like fingers grasping at something just beyond reach. Their bark caught my headlights and reflected it back in patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometric designs that seemed to shift and crawl when I wasn't focusing on them. The delivery address was supposed to be at Mason's Quarry, an industrial site that the manifest claimed had been operating continuously since but when I finally found the turnoff marked by a sign so weathered that the letters looked like they'd been carved by wind rather than painted, the road descended at an angle that made my ears pop. The Kenworth's engine strained against the grade, not from the weight of the trailer but from something that felt like atmospheric pressure, as if I was driving into the bottom of an ocean that happened to be filled with air instead of water. The quarry, when I finally reached it, wasn't what I'd expected. Instead of the usual terraced levels of extracted stone, I found myself looking at a spiral of roads that wound downward into darkness, so complete that my headlights seemed to be absorbed rather than reflected. The facility buildings lined this spiral like prayer beads on a string, each one identical to the last, windowless concrete structures with loading docks that faced inward toward the descending road. A figure emerged from the administrative building as I pulled into the loading area, walking with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to receiving deliveries at unreasonable hours. He was ordinary in the way that makes people instantly forgettable, medium height and build, wearing clothes that could have come from any decade between them. His clipboard looked official enough, and his signature on my delivery receipt was perfectly legible, though I couldn't quite remember what name he'd written even as I watched him write it. The unloading process should have taken hours, given the weight and apparent complexity of my cargo, but the facility's crew worked with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. They knew exactly where every piece of equipment needed to go, moving in coordination that suggested they'd performed this exact task hundreds of times before. They didn't speak to each other, didn't speak to me, but somehow managed to empty my trailer faster than any loading dock crew I'd ever worked with. The air that rose from those depths carried scents that reminded me of machine oil and ozone, with an underlying sweetness that made my stomach turn. When I dropped a pebble over the edge, I never heard it land, just listened as the tiny sound of its bouncing against the quarry walls faded into a silence so complete it seemed to have physical weight. The crew chief appeared at my elbow without making a sound, startling me back from the edge. He handed me an envelope that felt heavier than it should have, filled with cash in denominations I hadn't seen outside of a bank in years. When I asked about a receipt, he smiled with teeth that were too white and too even, and assured me that everything was properly documented. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that I should take Route 12 back to the interstate instead of retracing my path, something about road construction that would make my original route impassable until morning. I was grateful for the advice as I pulled away from Mason's Quarry, my empty trailer, feeling somehow heavier than it had when fully loaded. The rain had intensified while I was making my delivery, turning the world beyond my headlights into a curtain of water that seemed to muffle not just sound, but thought itself. Route 12 stretched ahead of me like a ribbon of relatively dry asphalt, and I settled into the familiar rhythm of night driving, letting the Kenworth's engine and the steady percussion of rain against my windshield lull me into the meditative state that made long hauls bearable. But as the miles passed, I began to notice things that didn't fit the geography I thought I knew. Road signs that listed distances to towns I'd never heard of. Exit ramps that curved away into darkness so complete they might have led to other planets. The radio continued to pick up fragments of broadcasts, but the voices spoke in languages that weren't quite English, discussing weather patterns for regions that didn't exist and traffic conditions on highways that weren't on any map. It was nearly dawn when I realized I'd been driving in circles, not literally, but through some kind of geographical loop that brought me past the same configuration of landmarks every 47 minutes, as if the road itself was caught in a repeating pattern that had nothing to do with physical distance. The fuel gauge should have been approaching empty after 6 hours of driving, but it remained stubbornly fixed at 3/4 full, while the odometer continued to accumulate miles at a steady pace. The sun finally broke through the storm clouds as I crested a hill I didn't remember climbing, and suddenly I was back on familiar highway, with recognizable towns and gas stations that had definitely existed the day before. The radio crackled back to normal reception, picking up the morning news from Seattle, as if nothing unusual had ever happened. My GPS cheerfully announced that I was 18 minutes away from my home terminal, where I could drop off my trailer and complete the paperwork for what had turned out to be one of the most profitable runs of my career. The envelope of cash was still sitting on my passenger seat, though I couldn't remember putting it there, and the delivery receipt was properly signed and dated in my logbook. According to every official record, I'd completed a routine delivery to an established client, transported industrial equipment across a distance that matched my odometer readings, and been paid exactly what the manifest had promised. There was no evidence that anything unusual had occurred, no proof that I'd driven through a version of Washington state that existed slightly to the left of reality. But sometimes on quiet nights when I'm hauling freight through the mountain passes, I catch glimpses of roads that branch off into territories that aren't quite there, marked by signs that fade from view when I try to read them directly. The Rubber Ghosts of Highway 89, from Marcus Chantia. The first time I saw those tires bouncing down Highway 89, I thought my coffee had gone cold one too many times, and my eyes were playing tricks on me. It was 3 in the morning on a Tuesday in late October, the kind of night when the desert air carries whispers you can't quite make out, and the stars seem closer than they should. I'd been driving my Peterbilt 309 for 15 years, hauling everything from electronics to furniture across the southwestern states, and I thought I'd seen every strange thing these long highways had to offer. The road stretched endlessly ahead of me through the Nevada wasteland, my headlights carving twin tunnels through the darkness, while the engine hummed its familiar lullaby. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other drivers, but mostly it was just me, the asphalt, and the endless expanse of sagebrush and Joshua trees, silhouetted against the starlit sky. The air conditioning whispered steadily, keeping the desert heat at bay, and my GPS showed another 2 hours until my next mandatory rest stop. That's when I first noticed them in my peripheral vision. 3 dark shapes moving parallel to my truck about 50 yards off the highway. At first glance, they looked like tumbleweeds caught in some strange wind pattern, but tumbleweeds don't bounce with such perfect rhythm, and they certainly don't maintain a steady pace alongside an 18-wheeler doing 70 miles per hour. I eased off the accelerator slightly and watched as the shapes continued their peculiar dance across the desert floor. 3 truck tires, massive steel-belted radials still mounted on their rims, were bouncing across the rough terrain with an almost playful energy. They moved in perfect synchronization, rising and falling like dolphins playing in invisible waves, their black rubber surfaces gleaming dully in the starlight. Each bounce carried them forward with purpose, as if they knew exactly where they were going and were in no particular hurry to get there. I reached for my CB radio, thumb hovering over the talk button, ready to ask if anyone else was seeing what I was seeing. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way the tires seemed to be keeping pace with me deliberately. Or maybe it was the complete silence of the radio waves, unusual for this typically busy stretch of highway. Instead, I simply watched, mesmerized by the strange ballet unfolding in the desert beside me. The tires bounced with an almost musical quality, their rhythm matching the steady thrum of my diesel engine. Bounce, roll, bounce, roll, each movement precise and graceful despite their considerable weight. I'd handled enough truck tires in my career to know that each one probably weighed close to 100 pounds. Yet they moved through the air with the lightness of soap bubble. The desert floor showed no signs of their impact, no dust clouds or disturbed vegetation, as if they were barely touching the earth before launching themselves skyward again. Minutes passed in this surreal procession, my truck and the bouncing tires moving through the night like some fever dream of the highway. I found myself slowing down gradually, not wanting to leave them behind, drawn by a curiosity that felt both natural and deeply unsettling. The speedometer dropped to 60, then 55, and still the tires maintained their steady pace alongside me. It was then that I noticed the writing on their sidewalls, faded white letters barely visible in the darkness. My headlights weren't angled right to illuminate them clearly, but I could make out fragments of text that seemed familiar somehow. Brand names and size specifications, the usual tire markings, but there was something else there too, something that made my chest tighten with an emotion I couldn't name. The radio suddenly burst to life with a crackling transmission, startling me from my trance-like observation. Breaker 19, this is Desert Rose, looking for the blue Peterbilt on the 89. You got your ears on, driver? The voice was clear and urgent, cutting through the static like a knife. I grabbed the handset, grateful for human contact. This is Marcus in the blue Pete. I copy you, Desert Rose. What's your 20? I replied, my voice sounding strange in my own ears after the long silence. Because if those aren't the damnedest things bouncing around in the desert, I had to pull over and get some sleep. My blood chilled. She could see them too. Copy that, Desert Rose. I've been watching them for about 15 minutes now. Any idea what we're looking at here? There was a long pause before her voice came back, lower and more cautious. Marcus, I need you to listen to me real careful. Those tires, can you make out any of the markings on them? Any writing or numbers? The tires continued their hypnotic bouncing, and as one of them caught the light just right, I could clearly see a series of numbers and letters on its sidewall. My throat went dry as I read them aloud into the radio. Looks like, Jesus, it's showing 2095, 75 R22. Looks like property of Westfield Trucking. The silence that followed stretched so long I thought I'd lost the signal. When Desert Rose's voice finally returned, it carried a tremor that made my hands grip the steering wheel tight. Marcus, you need to speed up and get away from those things right now. Westfield Trucking went out of business 3 years ago, after that big accident on Highway 89. Driver named Tommy Westfield lost control in a dust storm, jackknifed his rig, right around mile marker. Truck rolled 6 times, and scattered parts across a quarter-mile of desert. I glanced at my odometer and felt ice water fill my veins. Mile marker 2047 was less than 2 miles ahead. Desert Rose, what happened to the driver? 3 tires suddenly changed direction, angling toward the highway. They cleared the guardrail in 3 perfect arcs, landing on the asphalt with silent grace before beginning to bounce down the center line ahead of me. My headlights illuminated them fully now, and I could see every detail with crystal clarity. The rubber was weathered and cracked, the rims showing rust and desert wear, but they moved with purpose and intelligence. The lead tire turned slightly as it bounced, and I swear I could see a face in the pattern of wear on its surface, weathered features etched in rubber and road grime, eyes that seemed to look back at me with desperate recognition. The other 2 tires flanked it like an honor guard, their bouncing rhythm now perfectly synchronized with the beating of my heart. Marcus, are you still there? Desert Rose's voice crackled through the radio, but it seemed to come from very far away. I'm here, I whispered, unable to take my eyes off the supernatural parade ahead of me. They're on the highway now, bouncing right down the center line. It's like they're leading me somewhere. Mile marker 247 appeared in my headlights, and the tires immediately veered toward the right shoulder. They bounced once more in unison, before rolling to a complete stop in the exact spot where the guardrail showed scrape marks and fresh repair. For a moment they sat perfectly still, 3 silent sentinels marking the site of tragedy. Then, as I watched in fascination and growing dread, the face in the lead tire's wear pattern became clearer. The features were kind but weary, the face of a man who'd spent his life on the highways, who died doing what he loved. The tire began to glow with a faint phosphorescence, and I could hear something that might have been a voice carried on the desert wind. "Tell them I'm still here." I pulled my truck to the shoulder and sat in the darkness, engine idling, trying to process what I'd witnessed. The tires remained motionless for several minutes, their supernatural glow gradually fading until they were just 3 pieces of truck equipment sitting beside an empty highway. But I knew they weren't just equipment anymore. They were something else entirely, a memorial, a message, a piece of Tommy Westfield that couldn't rest. Desert Rose's truck appeared in my mirrors, her headlights sweeping across the scene as she pulled up behind me. Together we sat in the pre-dawn darkness, 2 travelers who'd witnessed something that would change how we saw every mile of highway ahead of us.